When you think of SpongeBob SquarePants, the first things that come to mind are probably laughter, jellyfishing, and maybe a few Krabby Patties. It's a bright, silly cartoon about a talking sponge who just wants to have fun with his friends. But every once in a while, SpongeBob takes a little detour into the weird, the creepy, and even the downright spooky. Graveyard Shift is probably the most famous scary SpongeBob episode, and it's easy to see why. The episode starts when Mr. Krabs decides the Krusty Krab should stay open 24 hours to make more money. SpongeBob is excited about working the night shift, but Squidward is less than thrilled about spending his evenings with his hyperactive coworker. To pass the time during the slow night hours, Squidward decides to tell SpongeBob a ghost story. But this isn't just any ghost story. Squidward really commits to it, creating this elaborate tale about the hash-slinging slasher, a former fry cook who died in a gruesome accident. According to Squidward's story, this fry cook was working late one night when he accidentally cut off his own hand with a rusty spatula. In his shock and pain, he knocked over the grill, starting a grease fire. Then, trying to escape the flames, he ran out into the street and got hit by a bus. Squidward tells SpongeBob that every Tuesday night, the hash-slinging slasher's ghost returns to the Krusty Krab, and you'll know he's coming because of 3 specific signs. The lights will flicker, the phone will ring with no one on the other end, and the slasher himself will arrive on the bus that killed him. SpongeBob is absolutely terrified by this story. He spends the rest of the night jumping at every sound and shadow, clearly convinced that the hash-slinging slasher is going to show up at any moment. Squidward is enjoying himself, pleased that his storytelling has had such a dramatic effect. But then something strange starts happening. The exact events from Squidward's story begin occurring in real life. First, the lights start flickering. SpongeBob immediately panics, but Squidward tries to play it off as just a coincidence or a problem with the electrical system. Then the phone rings, and when Squidward answers it, there's nothing but breathing on the other end. Now even Squidward is starting to get nervous. Things get really intense when they see a figure approaching the restaurant through the fog. It's moving slowly, dragging something behind it, and it's heading straight for the Krusty Krab. Both SpongeBob and Squidward are now completely terrified, hiding behind the counter and convinced that the hash-slinging slasher has actually come for them. The atmosphere during these scenes is genuinely creepy. The lighting gets darker, the music becomes ominous, and there's this real sense of dread building up. For a few minutes, it actually feels like you're watching a horror movie rather than a children's cartoon. When the figure finally reaches the restaurant and knocks on the door, both characters are paralyzed with fear. They're absolutely convinced that they're about to face a supernatural killer. But when they finally work up the courage to answer the door, they discover that the hash-slinging slasher is actually just a nervous young guy named Harold who wants to apply for a job. The resolution is perfectly SpongeBob. Every scary element has a completely innocent explanation. Harold has been trying to work up the courage to apply for weeks, which is why he keeps showing up at night. The spatula he was dragging was just his own cooking utensil that he brought to demonstrate his skills. The phone calls were him trying to call about the job but getting too nervous to speak. And the flickering lights, well, that was Nosferatu flipping the light switch upstairs because apparently he lives there now. It's a classic SpongeBob ending where everything scary turns out to be harmless. But what makes this episode memorable is how committed it is to the creepy atmosphere in the middle section. Those few minutes where it seems like Squidward's ghost story might actually be coming true are genuinely unsettling. The episode also became famous for its quotable moments. The dramatic way Squidward delivers "at night" during his story became a popular meme, and the hash-slinging slasher himself became an iconic SpongeBob character, even though he turned out to be completely made up. Rock Bottom takes a completely different approach to being scary. Instead of supernatural horror, it taps into the very real fear of being lost and unable to communicate with anyone around you. The episode starts with SpongeBob and Patrick on a field trip to Glove World, but they accidentally get on the wrong bus and end up in Rock Bottom, a strange underground community. Rock Bottom is immediately unsettling just from its visual design. Where Bikini Bottom is bright and colorful, Rock Bottom is dark and gloomy, lit by dim green light that makes everything look sickly. The town is built vertically instead of horizontally, with buildings stacked on top of each other and connected by steep, rickety ramps and elevators that look like they might collapse at any moment. But the really disturbing thing about Rock Bottom is its residents. They all speak by making these weird raspberry sounds with their tongues, creating a language that's completely incomprehensible to outsiders. When SpongeBob tries to ask for directions or help, all he gets are these strange buzzing noises that he can't understand at all. Patrick manages to catch the next bus back to Bikini Bottom, but SpongeBob gets left behind when his ticket blows away just as he's trying to board. Suddenly, he's completely alone in this alien environment where nothing makes sense and nobody can understand him. What follows is SpongeBob's increasingly desperate attempts to get home. He tries to buy another ticket, but he can't understand the ticket seller. He tries to read the signs, but they're all written backwards or in some kind of incomprehensible script. He gets in line for buses, but he can never figure out if he's in the right line or if the bus is going where he needs to go. The residents of Rock Bottom aren't hostile, but they're so different from anything SpongeBob has ever encountered that he can't relate to them at all. They have these exaggerated, alien features, bulging eyes, long tongues, weird body proportions that make them look more like deep-sea creatures than the friendly fish of Bikini Bottom. Every time SpongeBob thinks he's figured out how to get home, something goes wrong. He drops his ticket, or he gets on the wrong bus, or he misunderstands the directions. The episode really captures that nightmare feeling of being in a place where all the normal rules don't apply and you can't make yourself understood. There's also this constant sense of vertigo because everything in Rock Bottom is built on these steep angles and precarious platforms. SpongeBob is constantly climbing up and down these dangerous-looking ramps, and you get the feeling that one wrong step could send him tumbling into some dark pit. The episode does have its funny moments. SpongeBob's attempts to communicate with the locals lead to some classic physical comedy. But underneath all the humor is this persistent anxiety about being trapped in an unfamiliar place. Most people can relate to the experience of being lost or confused in a new environment, and this episode takes those feelings and amplifies them into something genuinely distressing. Eventually, SpongeBob gets home thanks to a helpful anglerfish, but the episode doesn't really explain why Rock Bottom exists or why it's so different from everywhere else. There's this suggestion that there are just some places in the world that are fundamentally alien and incomprehensible, which is both realistic and slightly disturbing. Squid's visit starts as a simple story about SpongeBob wanting Squidward to visit his house, but it quickly becomes something that feels more like a psychological thriller. SpongeBob really wants Squidward to come over, but Squidward keeps making excuses to avoid it. So SpongeBob comes up with what he thinks is a brilliant solution. He'll redecorate his entire house to look exactly like Squidward's place. The episode shows SpongeBob working obsessively to recreate every single detail of Squidward's house. He's measuring furniture, taking notes, and somehow managing to duplicate everything with perfect accuracy. When Squidward finally does visit after hurting himself and needing SpongeBob's help, he's shocked to discover that SpongeBob has essentially built a perfect replica of his own home. But this isn't just a general recreation. SpongeBob has copied everything. The same furniture in the same positions, the same books on the shelves in the same order, the same decorations on the walls, even the same dust patterns and minor imperfections. When Squidward looks around, it's like being in his own house, except he knows he's not. What makes this episode creepy is the implication of how SpongeBob managed to get all these details right. Some of the things he's recreated are personal items that Squidward keeps in private spaces. There are details about his daily routines, his personal habits, his private belongings that SpongeBob couldn't possibly know unless he'd been watching very closely. Squidward's reaction makes it even more unsettling. At first, he's just confused and impressed by the attention to detail. But then he starts noticing things that are too accurate, too personal. His private journal is there, with entries that SpongeBob couldn't have known about. His secret hiding places have been discovered and replicated. Even his dirty laundry pile is in the exact right spot. The episode plays out like a home invasion movie, except the invasion already happened and SpongeBob has been invited in. There's this growing sense of paranoia as Squidward realizes that SpongeBob knows much more about his private life than he should. It raises uncomfortable questions about boundaries, privacy, and how closely SpongeBob has been observing his neighbor. SpongeBob, meanwhile, is completely oblivious to how disturbing this situation island. He's just proud of his work and happy that Squidward is finally visiting. The contrast between SpongeBob's innocent enthusiasm and the genuinely invasive nature of what he's done creates this cognitive dissonance that makes the whole episode feel wrong. Shanghai features SpongeBob and Patrick accidentally boarding the Flying Dutchman's ghost ship, and in this episode, the Flying Dutchman is genuinely frightening. Unlike later episodes where he becomes more of a comedic character, here he's portrayed as a legitimate supernatural threat who seems genuinely dangerous. The ghost ship itself is appropriately creepy, with rotting wood, eerie green lighting, and an atmosphere of decay and death. When the Flying Dutchman appears, he's furious that living beings have boarded his vessel, and he threatens to steal their souls and make them part of his undead crew forever. What makes this episode particularly unsettling is how helpless SpongeBob and Patrick are against this supernatural force. They're trapped on a ghost ship with a powerful spirit who has no reason to show them mercy. The Flying Dutchman seems genuinely threatening in a way that most SpongeBob villains don't. He's not just annoying or misguided, he's actually dangerous. The episode has multiple endings that were produced for different markets, but in all of them, there's this sense that SpongeBob and Patrick have encountered something genuinely otherworldly and threatening. Even when they escape, you get the feeling that they've had a brush with forces beyond their understanding. Hall Monitor might not seem scary at first glance, but it's actually one of the most anxiety-inducing episodes in the series. SpongeBob becomes the Hall Monitor at Missus, Huff's boating school, and takes the job so seriously that he accidentally causes chaos everywhere he goes. What makes this episode disturbing is how SpongeBob's good intentions lead to increasingly catastrophic consequences. He's genuinely trying to help people and do the right thing, but everything he touches turns into a disaster. Cars crash, buildings catch fire, and there's this growing sense that SpongeBob is some kind of walking catastrophe who destroys everything he encounters. The news reports describing the maniac terrorizing the city are particularly unsettling because they're describing SpongeBob, who has no idea that he's causing all this destruction. There's something genuinely disturbing about watching a character you care about being portrayed as a dangerous criminal when he's just trying to be helpful. The episode captures that nightmare feeling of trying to do the right thing but making everything worse. SpongeBob's growing confusion and distress as he realizes that people are afraid of him is genuinely sad and uncomfortable to watch. Sleepy Time. Sleepy Time is an episode where SpongeBob accidentally enters other characters' dreams, and what he discovers there is often revealing and disturbing. The episode starts when SpongeBob accidentally leaves his own dream and begins wandering through other people's subconscious minds. Patrick's dream is particularly unsettling. It's essentially a barren wasteland with nothing but empty space and a few random objects. This suggests that Patrick's mind is essentially empty, which is both funny and kind of sad when you think about it. Squidward's dream reveals his deep insecurities about his artistic abilities and his fear of being mediocre. We see him performing for an audience that gradually becomes more and more hostile, reflecting his real-world anxieties about not being appreciated or understood. But the most disturbing dream is SpongeBob's own. When he finally returns to his own mind, he encounters his more, a sophisticated, intellectual version of himself who criticizes SpongeBob for being childish and irresponsible. This inner SpongeBob is cold and judgmental, suggesting that even SpongeBob has doubts about his own personality and behavior. The episode suggests that everyone's inner life is much more complex and troubled than their outward appearance would suggest. The dreams reveal fears, insecurities, and dark thoughts that the characters would never express when they're awake. Wormy. Wormy contains some of the most genuinely frightening imagery in early SpongeBob history. Sandy's pet caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, but when SpongeBob and Patrick see it, they think it's a monster because they've never encountered a butterfly before. What makes this episode scary is the close-up shots of the butterfly. Instead of using animated butterfly imagery, the episode shows real footage of an actual butterfly, and the extreme close-ups of its face and compound eyes are genuinely unsettling. The contrast between the cartoon world and this realistic insect footage creates an uncanny valley effect that's deeply disturbing. SpongeBob and Patrick's terrified reactions to the butterfly make it even scarier. They're convinced they're looking at some kind of dangerous predator, and their panic is so genuine that it makes viewers question whether the butterfly really is as harmless as it seems. The episode plays with the idea that sometimes the most innocent things can appear threatening when you don't understand them. But the realistic butterfly footage is so jarring compared to the rest of the show's art style that it creates this sense of something genuinely alien invading the cartoon world. Part 2. The Faces You Can't Forget. While some SpongeBob episodes are remembered for their scary plots, others are famous for their disturbing visuals. These episodes feature animation and imagery that push the boundaries of what you'd expect to see in a children's cartoon, creating images that stick with viewers long after the episode ends. Face Freeze. Face Freeze is probably the most infamous SpongeBob episode when it comes to disturbing imagery. The episode starts with something completely innocent, SpongeBob and Patrick making funny faces at each other, trying to see who can come up with the most ridiculous expression. It's the kind of harmless fun that kids engage in all the time. Mr. Krabs walks by and sees them making faces, so he tells them the old warning that parents have been using for generations. If you make an ugly face and the wind changes, your face will freeze that way forever. It's one of those things adults say to get children to stop doing something, not really expecting them to believe it. But SpongeBob and Patrick take this warning as a challenge rather than advice. They decide it would be fun to try to get their faces frozen in silly expressions, so they start making even more extreme faces, competing to see who can create the most outrageous look. Then a strong wind blows through Bikini Bottom, and suddenly both characters are stuck with the most grotesquely distorted faces imaginable. But these aren't just cartoon, funny, ugly faces, they're genuinely horrifying visages that look like something from a medical textbook about facial deformities. SpongeBob's frozen face is particularly disturbing. His eyes are bulging out of his head at impossible angles, with one eye significantly larger than the other, and both pointing in completely different directions. His mouth is stretched across his face in a way that suggests his jaw has been dislocated or broken, twisted into a shape that doesn't look anatomically possible. His nose is bent at a weird angle, and his entire facial structure looks like it's been melted and reformed. Patrick's face is equally nightmarish. His features seem to have migrated to completely wrong positions on his head. His nose appears where his ear should be, his mouth is sideways and stretched into an impossible grin, and his eyes are at different heights, giving him this lopsided, asymmetrical appearance that's deeply unsettling. What makes these images even more disturbing is how detailed they are. The animation shows every wrinkle, every impossible angle, every grotesque distortion in high definition. You can see individual facial muscles stretched in ways that look painful, skin pulled tight in unnatural directions, and features distorted beyond recognition. The episode then follows SpongeBob and Patrick as they try to go about their normal daily activities while looking like creatures from a nightmare. SpongeBob goes to work at the Krusty Krab, attempting to serve customers while his face is frozen in this horrifying expression. The customers' reactions range from shock to disgust to outright terror. But SpongeBob doesn't understand why everyone is so upset because he can't see his own reflection. There's something deeply uncomfortable about watching other characters try to interact normally with SpongeBob and Patrick while they look like horror movie monsters. The other residents of Bikini Bottom are clearly disturbed by their appearances, but they're trying to be polite and not hurt their feelings. The episode also features these lingering close-up shots of the distorted faces that feel almost sadistic. The camera holds on these horrifying expressions for much longer than necessary, forcing viewers to really examine these nightmare images in detail. It's like the episode wants to make sure you'll never forget what you're seeing. Sandy tries to help them by explaining the scientific impossibility of faces actually freezing from wind, but her logical explanations don't change the fact that they're still stuck looking like monsters. Squidward is mostly just annoyed that their appearance is scaring away customers at the Krusty Krab. Eventually, SpongeBob and Patrick figure out how to unfreeze their faces by making even more extreme expressions in the opposite direction, but the damage to viewers' psyches is already done. Those images of their distorted faces have become some of the most shared, cursed SpongeBob images on the internet. The episode raises interesting questions about the nature of physical appearance and how we react to people who look different from what we expect. But mostly, it's remembered for creating some of the most genuinely disturbing imagery in children's television history. Nasty Patty. The Nasty Patty episode creates what might be the most revolting food item ever depicted in a children's cartoon. The story involves SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, thinking they're dealing with a fake health inspector, so they decide to teach him a lesson by creating an intentionally disgusting burger. The construction of this burger is shown in stomach-churning detail. They start with ingredients that have clearly been sitting out for far too long: meat that's turned green with mold, lettuce that's black and slimy, and condiments that have separated and gone bad. The ketchup looks more like chunky blood, and the mayonnaise has developed a crust that suggests it's been exposed to air for weeks. But they don't stop with just spoiled food. The episode shows them deliberately adding things that were never meant to be consumed by humans. There are toenail clippings, which raises the disturbing question of whose toenails they are and why they're available in the Krusty Krab kitchen. There's what appears to be old gym socks, some kind of industrial cleaning fluid, and other substances that look more like toxic waste than food ingredients. The visual presentation of this burger construction is genuinely nauseating. You can see mold growing on the ingredients, flies buzzing around the decay, and various substances oozing and dripping in ways that make your stomach turn. The attention to detail in depicting this rot and contamination is almost clinical in its accuracy. When the burger is finally assembled, it's this green, moldy, moving mass that barely resembles food. There are things growing on it that appear to be alive, and the whole creation seems to have achieved some kind of gross biological activity. The smell must be overwhelming, because other characters react with physical revulsion just from being near it. The health inspector actually eats this monstrosity, which is horrifying to watch. He takes a big bite of this festering mass of decay and contamination, and his immediate reaction suggests that it tastes exactly as bad as it looks. Within seconds, he collapses, apparently from food poisoning so severe that SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs think they've killed him. What follows is even more disturbing than the burger itself. The health inspector lies there completely motionless, with his tongue hanging out and his eyes rolled back, and the episode really commits to making him look like a corpse rather than just someone who's unconscious. His body is positioned in an unnatural way that suggests he's actually dead rather than just sick. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs spend the rest of the episode convinced they've committed murder. They try to hide what they think is a dead body, discussing how to dispose of it, and worrying about going to prison. Watching SpongeBob innocent, optimistic SpongeBob acting like he's involved in a cover-up is genuinely disturbing. The episode eventually reveals that the health inspector was just unconscious from exhaustion and food poisoning. Not dead, but for most of the runtime, we're watching beloved characters believe they've killed someone and try to cover it up. It's a surprisingly dark premise for a children's show. The Splinter. The Splinter is remembered as one of the most medically graphic episodes in SpongeBob history. The episode deals with SpongeBob getting a small splinter in his thumb and then obsessing over it until it becomes a major medical emergency. The episode begins innocuously enough. SpongeBob gets a tiny splinter while working at the Krusty Krab. Instead of dealing with it properly by removing it and cleaning the wound, SpongeBob becomes convinced that he needs to hide it from Mr. Krabs because he's afraid of being sent home from work. What starts as a minor injury quickly escalates into a grotesque medical disaster. The episode shows the splinter in extreme close-up detail, and you can actually see it moving under SpongeBob's skin as the wound becomes infected. The visual of this small piece of wood squirming around inside his thumb is genuinely disturbing. As the episode progresses, the infection gets progressively worse. SpongeBob's thumb starts swelling to impossible proportions, changing colors as the infection spreads through the tissue. We see the skin becoming inflamed and discolored, with the thumb growing larger and more grotesque as the situation deteriorates. The episode doesn't shy away from showing the medical details of this infection. There are close-up shots of pus oozing out of the wound, the discoloration of infected tissue, and the way the splinter seems to be working its way deeper into SpongeBob's thumb. It's like watching a medical documentary about wound infection, except it's supposed to be entertainment for children. SpongeBob's attempts to hide the injury become increasingly desperate and dangerous. He wraps his thumb in bandages, tries to cover it with various objects, and even attempts to disguise it as other things. But the infection keeps getting worse, and his thumb keeps swelling until it's this grotesquely oversized appendage that barely looks like a body part anymore. The climax of the episode involves SpongeBob's infected thumb literally exploding, covering other characters in infected biological material. It's played for laughs, but the visual is genuinely revolting. Watching a body part burst open and spray contaminated tissue everywhere is not typical children's television content. I Had an Accident. While I Had an Accident is more famous for its psychological themes, it also contains some disturbing medical imagery. The episode deals with SpongeBob becoming paranoid about getting hurt after breaking his butt in a sandboarding accident. The accident itself is shown in surprisingly graphic detail for a children's show. We see SpongeBob's catastrophic crash, and then the episode shows an X-ray of his broken posterior, complete with medical terminology and realistic bone fractures. For a cartoon that usually keeps injuries comedic and unrealistic, this medical imagery is jarring. The X-ray scene features detailed anatomical drawings showing the extent of SpongeBob's injury. There are medical professionals discussing his condition using actual medical terms, and the whole sequence feels more like a hospital drama than a children's cartoon. SpongeBob's subsequent paranoia about getting hurt again is visually represented through increasingly surreal imagery. His house becomes this fortress-like environment where he's barricaded himself in, and the episode shows his growing isolation and fear through disturbing visual metaphors. Wormy close-up footage. Wormy features some of the most jarring imagery in early SpongeBob history, primarily because of how it mixes cartoon animation with real-world footage. When Sandy's pet caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, the episode suddenly shifts from cartoon imagery to actual close-up footage of a real butterfly. These close-up shots of the butterfly's face and compound eyes are genuinely frightening, because they're so realistic compared to the cartoon world around them. The contrast between SpongeBob's simple, friendly art style and this detailed, alien-looking insect creates an uncanny valley effect that's deeply unsettling. The butterfly footage is shot in extreme close-up, showing every detail of the insect's anatomy in high definition. You can see the individual facets of its compound eyes, the texture of its wings, and the alien structure of its face in disturbing detail. It looks more like something from a nature documentary about predatory insects than a children's cartoon. SpongeBob and Patrick's terrified reactions to the butterfly make the imagery even more disturbing. They're convinced they're looking at some kind of monster, and their genuine panic makes viewers question whether this realistic butterfly really is as harmless as it's supposed to be. Just one bite removed. Scene. The original version of Just One Bite contained a scene that was removed from most broadcasts due to its violent content. The scene showed Squidward being set on fire by a security system at the Krusty Krab, complete with detailed animation of him being burned. In the removed scene, Squidward triggers a trap that involves a bucket of gasoline catching fire. The animation showed him being engulfed in flames, with detailed depictions of fire damage and burn injuries. The scene was removed because it showed a character being seriously burned, which was deemed too violent for children's television. Even though this scene was cut, it represents an example of how SpongeBob occasionally pushed the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for kids. The fact that it was animated and produced suggests that someone thought it was acceptable, even though it was later deemed too extreme. Hall Monitor destruction scenes. The original version of Hall Monitor included more detailed scenes of the destruction that SpongeBob accidentally causes during his well-intentioned patrol of the city. These scenes showed car crashes, building damage, and general chaos in more graphic detail than what made it to the final broadcast. Some versions of the episode included extended sequences of vehicular accidents, with more realistic depictions of crash damage and property destruction. These scenes were edited or removed in many markets because they showed too much realistic violence and destruction, even though it was accidental. The extended destruction scenes made SpongeBob's inadvertent rampage feel more serious and threatening, which worked against the episode's comedic intent. The edited versions focus more on the misunderstanding and confusion, rather than the actual damage being caused. Squidward's Day Off paranoia imagery. Squidward's Day Off contains some disturbing visual representations of paranoia and anxiety. As Squidward becomes increasingly worried about what's happening at the Krusty Krab while he's home with a back injury, the episode shows his imagined disasters in graphic detail. These paranoid fantasies include scenes of SpongeBob accidentally poisoning customers, burning down the restaurant, or causing other catastrophic accidents. The episode presents these imagined scenarios as if they're really happening, complete with dramatic visuals and sound effects. The contrast between Squidward's paranoid imagination and the reality of SpongeBob competently handling everything creates this weird psychological tension. We're essentially watching someone's anxiety disorder play out in visual form, which is surprisingly heavy for a children's cartoon. Part 3. When things get a little too real. Some SpongeBob episodes venture into psychological territory that feels surprisingly mature and realistic. These episodes deal with themes like existential dread, clinical depression, and anxiety in ways that are more sophisticated than you'd expect from a children's cartoon. SB 129. SB 129 is probably the most existentially terrifying episode in SpongeBob history. What starts as a simple time travel story becomes a meditation on loneliness, mortality, and the horrifying vastness of time. The episode begins with Squidward trying to avoid SpongeBob by hiding in the Krusty Krab freezer, but he accidentally gets frozen for 20 years. When Squidward wakes up, he finds himself in the far future, in a place called Chrome City. This future world is sterile and metallic, with everything rendered in cold, geometric shapes that feel more like the inside of a machine than a place where living beings would want to spend time. The architecture is imposing and unwelcoming, all sharp angles and harsh lighting that emphasizes how alone Squidward is in this environment. The only familiar faces he encounters are Spongetron, a robot version of SpongeBob, and Primitive Sponge, a caveman SpongeBob who's been preserved as some kind of historical artifact. When Squidward asks about his old friends and neighbors, Spongetron tells him they're gone. A simple word that carries enormous weight when you realize it means everyone Squidward ever knew has been dead for centuries. This realization hits Squidward hard, and you can see the existential horror dawning in his eyes. Everyone he ever cared about, everyone who made his world familiar and meaningful, has been erased by time. He's completely alone in a world that has moved on without him, and there's no way to go back to the life he knew. Desperate to escape this lonely future, Squidward uses Spongetron's time machine to travel to the past, but the prehistoric world he finds is even more isolating. It's almost completely empty, just endless water with no civilization, no familiar landmarks, and only primitive versions of the characters he knows. These prehistoric creatures don't have the personalities that make them recognizable. They're just simple animals operating on basic instincts. The emptiness of the prehistoric world is somehow more disturbing than the sterile efficiency of the future. At least Chrome City had technology and structure, even if it was cold and unwelcoming. The past has nothing, just void, and the suggestion that everything Squidward considers normal and meaningful hasn't happened yet and might never happen. But the most terrifying moment comes when Squidward tries to return to his own time and overshoots, ending up in a completely empty void. There's nothing but white space and the word alone echoing around him, getting louder and more distorted with each repetition. This sequence is genuinely horrifying because it represents the ultimate fear of isolation, being completely alone in an indifferent universe. The stark emptiness of this void creates a sense of sensory deprivation that's deeply unsettling. There are no reference points, no sense of scale or direction, no indication that anything else has ever existed or ever will exist. Just Squidward floating in nothingness while the universe itself seems to be mocking his isolation. When Squidward finally makes it back to his own time, his relief is palpable but also desperate. He's not just happy to see SpongeBob and Patrick, he's terrified of being alone again. The episode ends with him actually welcoming SpongeBob's company, but there's this underlying sense that he'll never quite forget what he experienced in that void. Are You Happy Now? Deals with clinical depression in a way that's surprisingly realistic and heavy for a children's show. The episode begins with Squidward having what he describes as the worst day ever, a series of minor frustrations and disappointments that leave him feeling down. But instead of bouncing back like he usually does, Squidward sinks into a genuine depressive episode. When SpongeBob asks him when he was last happy, Squidward realizes he can't remember ever being truly happy, which sends him even deeper into despair. The episode shows him becoming listless and hopeless, unable to find pleasure in anything. What makes this episode particularly heavy is how accurately it portrays the symptoms of clinical depression. Squidward doesn't just feel sad, he feels empty and disconnected from life. He can't engage with activities he used to enjoy, he isolates himself from others, and he seems unable to imagine that things will ever get better. The visual representation of Squidward's depression is striking. The animation becomes more muted and gray when he's on screen. His movements become sluggish and lifeless, and there's this general sense of heaviness that permeates every scene. You can actually see the depression affecting him physically, not just emotionally. SpongeBob tries to help by making a scrapbook of happy memories, but his well-intentioned efforts highlight how different their perspectives are. What SpongeBob remembers as happy moments, Squidward recalls as times when he was annoyed or frustrated. It's a realistic portrayal of how depression can recolor past experiences, making even potentially positive memories seem negative. The episode also shows how exhausting it can be to try to help someone with depression. SpongeBob puts enormous effort into cheering Squidward up, trying different approaches and activities, but nothing seems to work. There are moments where SpongeBob becomes frustrated and confused, not understanding why his usual optimism isn't helping. The original version of this episode apparently included a scene where Squidward contemplates suicide, though this was cut from most broadcasts. Even without that scene, there are moments where Squidward's despair feels frighteningly real and adult. His inability to find meaning or pleasure in anything is presented in a way that adults who have experienced depression will recognize immediately. The episode's resolution is somewhat hopeful but also realistic about the ongoing nature of mental health struggles. Squidward eventually finds something that makes him smile, but the episode doesn't pretend that one moment of happiness fixes everything. There's an acknowledgement that depression is something he'll have to continue dealing with. Squidward's Day Off. Squidward's Day Off starts with a simple premise. Squidward hurts his back and has to stay home from work while SpongeBob runs the Krusty Krab alone. But what should be a relaxing day off becomes a realistic portrayal of anxiety and paranoia spiraling out of control. At first, Squidward is genuinely happy to have some time away from work. He can practice his clarinet, read, and enjoy some peace and quiet. But then his mind starts working overtime. How is SpongeBob handling things at the restaurant? Is he following procedures correctly? Is he driving away customers? Is he accidentally poisoning people? What makes this episode disturbing is how accurately it shows the escalation of anxious thinking. Squidward starts with reasonable concerns. It's natural to wonder how things are going when you're not there, but his imagination quickly runs wild. He pictures SpongeBob causing increasingly catastrophic disasters, each scenario more elaborate and unlikely than the last. The episode shows these imagined disasters as if they're really happening, complete with dramatic visuals and sound effects. We see SpongeBob accidentally burning down the restaurant, serving customers food that's completely wrong, or causing other catastrophes that would genuinely be devastating for the business. But then the episode cuts back to reality, where SpongeBob is just doing his job normally. This contrast highlights how disconnected Squidward's anxiety has become from actual reality. His mind has created this parallel universe where everything is going wrong, even though the real world is functioning perfectly fine without him. It's a surprisingly accurate portrayal of how anxiety can create its own reality that feels completely real to the person experiencing it. Squidward becomes physically restless and agitated as his anxiety builds. He can't sit still, can't enjoy his day off, can't think about anything except what might be going wrong at work. His back injury becomes secondary to his mental distress, and he starts making increasingly desperate attempts to spy on the restaurant. The surveillance scenes have this almost thriller-like quality that's unusual for SpongeBob. Squidward sneaking around, hiding in bushes, desperately trying to catch SpongeBob making mistakes. It feels more like watching someone having a psychological breakdown than typical cartoon comedy. The episode captures that horrible feeling of not being able to turn your brain off, of having intrusive thoughts that you know are irrational but can't stop thinking about. Squidward's Day Off becomes a form of mental torture because his own mind won't let him relax. Krusty Love. Krusty Love deals with Mr. Krabs falling in love with Mrs. Puff, but it also explores themes of emotional manipulation and unhealthy relationship dynamics. Mr. Krabs becomes obsessed with impressing Mrs. Puff, spending ridiculous amounts of money and making increasingly desperate gestures to win her affection. What's disturbing about this episode is how it shows the way people can lose themselves in romantic obsession. Mr. Krabs abandons his core personality trait, his love of money in pursuit of love, but not in a healthy way. He becomes manic and desperate, making grand gestures that are more about his own need for validation than about actually caring for Mrs. Puff. SpongeBob gets caught in the middle of this, tasked with helping Mr. Krabs court Mrs. Puff. But SpongeBob's innocent attempts to help lead to increasingly uncomfortable situations where Mrs. Puff is being pressured and overwhelmed by unwanted romantic attention. The episode shows how romantic pursuit can become a form of harassment when the pursuer becomes so focused on their own desires that they stop considering the other person's feelings. Mrs. Puff becomes visibly uncomfortable with the attention, but Mr. Krabs is too caught up in his own emotions to notice. Plankton's Army. Plankton's Army explores themes of family dysfunction and the way childhood experiences can shape adult behavior. Plankton recruits his extended family to help him steal the Krabby Patty formula, but when they arrive, we see that his entire family is just as unsuccessful and bitter as He Island. The Plankton family gathering reveals a cycle of failure and resentment that goes back generations. All of Plankton's relatives are small, angry, and obsessed with get-rich-quick schemes that never work. They're constantly arguing with each other, putting each other down, and competing for status within their dysfunctional family dynamic. What's particularly sad about this episode is how it suggests that Plankton's villainous behavior might be the result of growing up in an environment where success was measured only by defeating others and accumulating wealth. His entire family operates on the assumption that the world is a zero-sum game where someone else's success means your failure. The family reunion scenes are uncomfortable to watch because they feel like real family gatherings, where old resentments and disappointments bubble to the surface. Everyone is trying to prove they're more successful than everyone else, but they're all clearly struggling with the same issues. The smoking peanut. The smoking peanut deals with themes of guilt, shame, and the psychological toll of keeping secrets. SpongeBob thinks he's made a clam cry by throwing a peanut at her, and the guilt eats away at him throughout the episode. He becomes increasingly paranoid and self-destructive, convinced that he's a terrible person who hurts innocent creatures. The episode shows how guilt can distort perception and make everything seem like evidence of your wrongdoing. SpongeBob interprets every coincidence and random event as confirmation that he's a bad person who deserves punishment. He becomes his own worst enemy, inflicting psychological torture on himself over something that wasn't even his fault. When the truth is finally revealed that the clam was crying because she was giving birth, not because of anything SpongeBob did, it provides relief, but also highlights how much unnecessary suffering SpongeBob inflicted on himself. The episode is a realistic portrayal of how anxiety and guilt can create their own reality. Fools in April. Fools in April explores the psychology of bullying and the way humor can be used as a weapon. Squidward plays an increasingly cruel prank on SpongeBob on April Fool's Day, starting with harmless jokes but escalating to genuine humiliation and emotional damage. What makes this episode disturbing is how it shows the progression from playful teasing to actual cruelty. Squidward starts out just trying to get back at SpongeBob for his annoying pranks, but as he sees how much he can hurt SpongeBob's feelings, he becomes increasingly sadistic. The climax involves Squidward playing a prank that genuinely humiliates SpongeBob in front of the entire restaurant. SpongeBob's reaction, crying and asking what he did to deserve such treatment, is heartbreaking and feels completely real. You're watching someone's spirit being broken for entertainment. The episode doesn't shy away from showing the real emotional damage that cruel jokes can cause. When SpongeBob runs away crying, other characters are genuinely disturbed by Squidward's behavior. Even Squidward realizes he's crossed a line, but the damage is already done. Band Geeks. While Band Geeks is generally considered one of the best SpongeBob episodes, it also deals with themes of failure, disappointment, and the crushing weight of expectations. Squidward promises that his band will perform at the Bubble Bowl, but when the time comes, they're completely unprepared and sound terrible. The episode shows Squidward's growing desperation as he realizes that his band is going to humiliate him in front of a massive audience. His worst fears about being a failure are about to be confirmed in the most public way possible. The anxiety and shame he experiences feel completely real and relatable. The eventual triumph of the band provides a happy ending, but not before the episode has thoroughly explored the fear of public failure and the way our own insecurities can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Part 4. Episodes Nickelodeon didn't want us to see. Throughout SpongeBob's long run, several episodes have been pulled from broadcast, banned in certain markets, or heavily censored due to content that networks decided was inappropriate for children. These episodes reveal how cultural standards change over time and show the complex decisions that go into determining what's suitable for kids' television. Midlife Crustacean. Midlife Crustacean is probably the most famous banned SpongeBob episode. It aired regularly for over 15 years before being quietly removed from broadcast rotation in 2018. The episode deals with Mr. Krabs going through what appears to be a midlife crisis, feeling old and disconnected from youth culture. The story begins with Mr. Krabs feeling depressed about his age. He watches SpongeBob and Patrick having fun and realizes that he feels old and out of touch with what it means to be young. He's lost that sense of spontaneity and adventure that he remembers from his younger days, and it's making him feel like his best years are behind him. SpongeBob and Patrick notice Mr. Krabs' depression and decide to help him feel young again by taking him out for a night of adventure. They want to show him that age doesn't have to mean giving up on fun and excitement. Most of the episode consists of typical SpongeBob activities. They go to a playground after hours, cause some harmless chaos at restaurants, and generally engage in the kind of silly behavior that's meant to help Mr. Krabs reconnect with his youthful energy. The episode works well as a character study, showing a more vulnerable side of Mr. Krabs that we rarely see. He's genuinely worried about getting older and losing his connection to the things that make life enjoyable. The voice acting really sells his emotional journey from depression to rediscovered happiness. The problem comes at the very end of the episode. Patrick suggests they go on a panty raid as the ultimate expression of youthful rebellion. In the context of when this episode was written, panty raids were seen as relatively harmless college pranks, inappropriate and immature, certainly, but not particularly threatening by the standards of early 2000s comedy. The three characters break into a house to steal women's underwear, treating it as the pinnacle of rebellious teenage behavior. The joke is supposed to be that they end up raiding Mr. Krabs' own house, where his mother catches them in the act. Mr. Krabs gets scolded by his mother like a child who's been caught doing something naughty, and the episode ends with him learning that maybe acting like a teenager isn't always the best approach to feeling young. When the episode first aired in 2003, this scene generated some complaints, but wasn't considered serious enough to warrant removing the episode from broadcast. Cultural standards at the time still viewed panty raids as outdated but relatively harmless pranks, like toilet papering houses or other juvenile mischief. However, as cultural awareness around consent, privacy, and sexual harassment evolved, particularly during the Me Too movement of the late 2010s, the scene began to be viewed much more critically. What was once seen as a harmless reference to college humor began to be recognized as depicting breaking and entering, combined with theft of women's intimate clothing, which is both illegal and a form of sexual harassment. Nickelodeon made the decision to pull the episode from rotation in 2018, around the time when many institutions were reevaluating their standards around content that could be seen as normalizing inappropriate behavior toward women. The network didn't make a public announcement about the ban. They simply removed it from broadcast schedules and streaming platforms. The quiet nature of the ban reflects how networks often prefer to handle controversial content, removing it without drawing additional attention to the problematic material. Most viewers didn't notice immediately, since it was just one episode among hundreds in SpongeBob's catalog. The episode can still be found on some older DVD releases and through unofficial channels online, but it's no longer part of the official SpongeBob catalog that Nickelodeon promotes. For many fans, this has made it something of a forbidden curiosity, a piece of SpongeBob history that represents how cultural standards can change dramatically over time. The Splinter. The Splinter has never been officially banned network-wide, but it's been heavily censored or completely removed from broadcast in many international markets due to its graphic medical content and potentially harmful messaging about injury care. The episode begins with SpongeBob getting a small splinter in his thumb while working at the Krusty Krab. Instead of dealing with it properly, removing the splinter, cleaning the wound, and maybe applying a bandage, SpongeBob becomes obsessed with hiding it from Mr. Krabs because he's afraid of being sent home from work. This premise immediately creates a problematic message about workplace safety and personal health care. SpongeBob's dedication to his job becomes more important than his physical well-being, and the episode seems to present this as admirable behavior rather than something concerning. As the episode progresses, the splinter becomes severely infected because SpongeBob refuses to treat it properly. The wound begins to swell dramatically, change colors, and develop obvious signs of serious infection. The animation shows this process in graphic detail, with close-up shots of infected tissue, discoloration, and the formation of pus. The visual representation of the infection is genuinely disturbing and medically accurate in ways that make it unsuitable for children's television. We see the splinter moving under SpongeBob's skin, the wound becoming increasingly inflamed, and the thumb swelling to grotesque proportions. It's essentially medical horror presented as comedy. SpongeBob's attempts to hide the injury become increasingly dangerous as the infection worsens. He covers it with various objects, tries to disguise it as other things, and continues working despite obvious pain and deteriorating health. The episode essentially shows a character choosing work responsibilities over basic medical care. The climax involves SpongeBob's infected thumb literally exploding, covering other characters in infected biological material. While this is played for laughs, it's essentially showing the catastrophic failure of proper wound care, complete with detailed animation of contaminated tissue spraying everywhere. Many international broadcasters have either banned the episode entirely or edited it so heavily that it becomes barely comprehensible. In some versions, entire scenes are removed, leaving gaps in the narrative that make the episode difficult to follow. The fact that so much content had to be cut suggests that the episode may have been inappropriate for children's television from the beginning. Medical professionals and children's safety advocates have criticized the episode for potentially encouraging children to hide injuries from adults and avoid seeking proper medical care. The message that work or school attendance is more important than health is exactly the opposite of what children should learn about taking care of themselves. Just One Bite. Just One Bite contains a scene that was removed from most broadcasts due to concerns about children imitating dangerous behavior. The episode involves Squidward becoming obsessed with trying a Krabby Patty after years of claiming they're disgusting. The removed scene shows Squidward attempting to break into the Krusty Krab after hours to steal a Krabby Patty. The restaurant's security system includes a series of elaborate traps designed to catch intruders. One of these traps involves a bucket of gasoline that ignites when triggered, engulfing Squidward in flames. The scene was removed because it showed a character being set on fire in graphic detail. There were concerns that children might try to recreate the security system or experiment with gasoline after seeing it portrayed on television. The scene also depicted fire in a way that might seem exciting or fun rather than genuinely dangerous. In the edited version that most people have seen, Squidward simply disappears from one scene and reappears in the next, charred and smoking, without any explanation of what happened to him. This creates a strange narrative gap that makes the episode feel incomplete. The removal of this scene reflects broader concerns about depicting fire and flammable liquids in children's media, particularly in contexts where they might seem like interesting things to experiment with rather than serious safety hazards. Red Mist, Squidward's Suicide. While Red Mist isn't actually a real SpongeBob episode, it's become such a significant part of SpongeBob urban mythology that it's worth discussing alongside the legitimate banned episodes. The story claims that there was a lost episode featuring Squidward's suicide that was created by disgruntled animators and accidentally broadcast once before being covered up by Nickelodeon. According to the creepypasta, the episode begins normally with Squidward performing a clarinet concert for an audience of other sea creatures. However, instead of the usual mixed reactions you'd expect, the audience responds with pure hostility, booing relentlessly and throwing objects at Squidward throughout his performance. The story usually describes Squidward becoming increasingly distraught as the performance continues, with the episode gradually becoming darker and more disturbing in both visuals and tone. Different versions of the creepypasta include various details about the episode featuring increasingly realistic imagery as it progresses, eventually showing Squidward returning home and becoming more depressed until he ultimately takes his own life. The Red Mist story has become popular because it taps into several cultural anxieties about children's media and corporate control. There's the fear that inappropriate content might accidentally make it onto children's television, the concern that animation studios might have employees with malicious intentions, and the worry that beloved characters might be subjected to horrible fates behind the scenes. The story has also been effective because it mirrors real concerns about banned episodes and lost media. Since SpongeBob has had episodes pulled from broadcast for various legitimate reasons, the idea that there might be an episode so disturbing that it was completely erased from existence doesn't seem entirely impossible to many fans. Numerous fake screenshots, audio recordings, and pieces of evidence have been created to support the Red Mist story, making it difficult for casual fans to determine what's real and what's fabricated. The story has inspired other creepypastas about lost SpongeBob episodes and has become a foundational piece of internet horror fiction. Sailor Mouth. While Sailor Mouth was never banned, it was controversial for its handling of profanity in children's television. The episode deals with SpongeBob and Patrick learning curse words, though the actual words are always censored with boat horn sounds whenever characters use them. The controversy arose because, while the specific words are never heard, the episode clearly deals with characters using strong profanity throughout the story. Some parents and advocacy groups felt that even discussing curse words in a children's show was inappropriate, regardless of whether the actual words were audible. Different international markets handled the episode differently based on their local standards. Some countries aired it without changes. Others edited out certain scenes or dialogue, and a few banned it entirely. The episode sparked broader discussions about how children's media should handle the topic of inappropriate language. The episode actually has a positive message about watching your language and thinking about how your words affect others, but the very premise of dealing with profanity made some broadcasters uncomfortable about airing it during children's programming blocks. SpongeBob Meets the Strangler. This episode features SpongeBob being stalked and threatened by the Tattletale Strangler, a criminal who wants to harm him for testifying against him in court. While the episode is played for comedy, some international markets found the stalking and threat elements too intense for young children. The Strangler spends most of the episode trying to find opportunities to hurt SpongeBob, who remains obliviously friendly throughout the ordeal. The contrast between SpongeBob's innocence and the Strangler's clearly murderous intentions creates an uncomfortable tension that some broadcasters felt was inappropriate for children's programming. The episode also deals with themes of violence and revenge that some markets deem too mature for young audiences. Different versions exist with various levels of editing, depending on local broadcast standards and cultural attitudes toward depicting threats against children, even in fictional contexts. Nasty Patty International Concerns. While Nasty Patty wasn't banned in most markets, it was heavily edited in many international versions due to its graphic depiction of food poisoning and what appears to be a dead body. The scene where the health inspector collapses after eating the contaminated burger was considered too graphic for some audiences. International versions often cut away before showing the inspector fall or edited the scene to make it immediately clear that he's only unconscious, not dead. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs' subsequent behavior, treating what they believe is a corpse, was also edited in many versions to remove scenes of them trying to hide the body or discussing their fears about being arrested for murder. These edits reflect different cultural attitudes toward death and violence in children's media, with some markets being much more conservative about showing characters dealing with what they believe to be a fatality, even in a comedic context. Hall Monitor. Extended Destruction. The original version of Hall Monitor included more detailed scenes of the destruction that SpongeBob accidentally causes during his well-intentioned patrol of the city. These extended sequences showed car crashes, building damage, and general chaos in more graphic detail than what made it to most broadcasts. Some markets felt that showing too much destruction, even in a comedic context, might encourage reckless behavior in children or be too intense for young viewers. The edited versions focused more on the misunderstanding and confusion rather than the actual damage being caused. The editing of this episode reflects broader concerns about depicting destructive behavior in children's media, even when the destruction is clearly accidental, and the character causing it is portrayed as innocent and well-meaning. One Course Meal. One Course Meal deals with Mr. Krabs deliberately terrorizing Plankton by exploiting his phobia of whales. The episode shows Mr. Krabs using psychological torture tactics to drive Plankton to the point of considering suicide, which many viewers found too dark for a children's show. While the episode wasn't officially banned, it received significant criticism for its portrayal of bullying and psychological abuse. Many fans consider it one of the most mean-spirited episodes in the series, and it's often cited as an example of how later seasons of SpongeBob sometimes lost touch with the show's original spirit of innocent fun. The episode's handling of suicide ideation, even in a cartoon context, made many viewers uncomfortable and sparked discussions about appropriate content for children's television. Part 5. SpongeBob Fan Theories. Over the years, SpongeBob fans have developed elaborate theories that completely reinterpret the show, transforming it from an innocent children's cartoon into something much darker and more complex. These theories range from somewhat plausible interpretations to completely wild speculation, but they all demonstrate how deeply the show has penetrated popular culture and how much people love to find hidden meanings in familiar content. Bikini Bottom as a nuclear testing site. One of the most detailed and persistent fan theories suggests that Bikini Bottom is located near Bikini Atoll, the real-world site where the United States conducted nuclear weapons testing from 1946 to 1958. According to this theory, all the anthropomorphic sea creatures in SpongeBob are actually mutants created by radiation exposure from these nuclear tests. The theory starts with the geographical connection that's hard to ignore. Bikini Atoll is a real place in the Marshall Islands that was used for 23 nuclear weapons tests during the Cold War era. The native population was evacuated from the area, and the environmental damage from the testing was severe and long-lasting. The fact that the show is set in a place called Bikini Bottom seems like it could be more than just a coincidence. Supporters of this theory point out that many aspects of the SpongeBob world start to make sense when you view them through the lens of radiation-induced mutation. The most obvious example is the fact that sea creatures can somehow create and sustain fire underwater, which defies all known laws of physics unless you assume that the normal rules of nature have been fundamentally altered by nuclear contamination. The presence of impossible geography like beaches, lagoons, and other land-based features existing underwater could be explained as the result of massive environmental damage that has completely restructured the ocean floor. The weird physics that govern Bikini Bottom, where characters can drive cars, use electronics, and engage in other surface world activities, while underwater starts to make sense if you assume the entire ecosystem has been irradiated and transformed. The character's behavior also fits this interpretation in interesting ways. Their childlike innocence and simple thought processes could be the result of neurological damage from radiation exposure. The fact that most characters seem to have very limited memory spans and don't appear to age or change significantly over time could be symptoms of radiation-induced brain damage that affects their cognitive development. SpongeBob's incredible optimism and apparent inability to recognize danger might not be personality traits, but symptoms of cognitive impairment caused by living in a contaminated environment. His constant happiness and enthusiasm could be a form of psychological protection against the trauma of existing in a post-nuclear wasteland, where his brain has essentially forgotten or blocked out the knowledge of what happened to his world. Patrick's extreme stupidity, which goes far beyond normal cartoon character ignorance, could also be explained as severe radiation damage affecting his intellectual capacity. Even Gary's inability to speak, except in that one episode where we hear his thoughts, might be the result of neurological damage affecting his communication abilities. The theory also provides an explanation for Sandy Cheeks' presence and behavior. As a land mammal who needs to wear a protective air suit to survive underwater, she could represent someone from the uncontaminated surface world who has to take special precautions to avoid radiation exposure when visiting Bikini Bottom. Her scientific knowledge and awareness of surface world technology contrasts sharply with the other characters' ignorance and isolation. The show's timeline supports this interpretation as well. SpongeBob often features cultural references, technology, and social structures that seem to come from the 1950s and early 1960s, exactly the same period when nuclear testing was taking place at Bikini Atoll. The characters might be stuck in a kind of temporal loop, forever reliving the era when their world was destroyed, unable to progress beyond that point due to the cognitive effects of radiation exposure. Some fans have pointed to specific episodes as evidence for this theory. SB-129, where Squidward travels through time and sees desolate future landscapes, could represent the long-term effects of nuclear contamination on the environment. The sterile, lifeless Chrome City that Squidward visits in the future might be what Bikini Bottom eventually becomes as the radiation damage accumulates over centuries. The 7 Deadly Sins theory. Another popular fan theory suggests that each of the main SpongeBob characters represents one of the 7 deadly sins, providing a moral and psychological framework for understanding their behavior and the dynamics between them. SpongeBob represents lust, but not in a sexual sense. Instead, his character embodies an excessive, almost compulsive desire for pleasure and gratification. He can't sit still, can't be content with simple, quiet activities, and constantly seeks out new experiences and sources of stimulation. His love for jellyfishing, bubble blowing, and Krabby Patty making goes far beyond normal enjoyment and becomes something closer to addiction. His relationship with work is also lustful in nature. SpongeBob doesn't just enjoy his job at the Krusty Krab, he's obsessed with it to an unhealthy degree. He works overtime voluntarily, comes in on his days off, dreams about making Krabby Patties, and defines his entire identity through his role as a fry cook. This isn't healthy dedication to one's career, it's an addictive relationship with the gratification he gets from work. Patrick represents sloth in its purest form. He's lazy to an extreme degree that goes beyond normal cartoon character behavior. Patrick actively avoids any activity that requires effort, thought, or responsibility. He sleeps for most of the day, shows no interest in self-improvement or learning, and seems genuinely proud of his ignorance and lack of ambition. Patrick's sloth extends beyond just physical laziness to include intellectual and emotional laziness as well. He actively resists learning new things, refuses to engage with complex ideas, and when presented with information that might require him to think or change his perspective, he either ignores it completely or forgets it immediately. This willful ignorance represents a form of spiritual sloth where he's chosen to avoid the work of growing as a person. Squidward embodies wrath in all its manifestations. He's constantly angry, bitter, and resentful about virtually every aspect of his existence. His hatred of his job, his neighbors, his living situation, and his life in general drives most of his actions throughout the series. He takes pleasure in being cruel and sarcastic to others, and he seems to genuinely enjoy making other people as miserable as he island. Squidward's wrath isn't just a reaction to external circumstances. It's become a fundamental part of his personality that he nurtures and maintains. Even when good things happen to him or when people try to be kind to him, he finds ways to be bitter and angry about the situation. His wrath has become self-perpetuating, creating a cycle where his anger makes his life worse, which gives him more reasons to be angry. Mr. Krabs represents greed in its most obvious and extreme form. His obsession with money goes far beyond normal business practices or financial responsibility and becomes a genuine avarice that affects every aspect of his life. He's willing to sacrifice his employees' well-being, his customer satisfaction, his relationships with friends and family, and even his own dignity if it means making or saving money. His greed influences every decision he makes, from major business choices down to the smallest details of daily life. He's willing to serve contaminated food, overwork his employees, cheat his customers, and engage in questionable business practices if it means increasing his profits. Even his relationship with his daughter Pearl is affected by his greed, as he often prioritizes financial concerns over her emotional needs. Sandy Cheeks represents pride, which manifests as excessive confidence in her own abilities, intelligence, and cultural background. She's constantly bragging about Texas, her scientific knowledge, her physical capabilities, and her superiority to the other residents of Bikini Bottom. She looks down on the other characters for being less educated, less capable, or less sophisticated than She Island. Sandy's pride extends to her cultural identity as well. She believes that everything about Texas and the surface world is inherently superior to everything about Bikini Bottom and underwater life. She often acts like she's doing the other characters a favor by sharing her knowledge and skills with them, rather than recognizing that they might have their own valuable qualities and perspectives. Mrs. Puff represents envy, driven primarily by her jealousy of other driving instructors who have normal, competent students. She's envious of people who don't have to deal with SpongeBob's destructive chaos during driving lessons, and she's bitter about her own circumstances compared to what she imagines other people's professional lives must be like. Her envy manifests as resentment towards SpongeBob for making her job so difficult, but it also extends to jealousy of anyone who seems to have an easier or more peaceful existence than she does. She's constantly comparing her situation to others and finding herself lacking, which feeds into a cycle of bitterness and self-pity. The theory usually assigns gluttony to Pearl, Mr. Krabs' teenage daughter, based on her appetite for shopping, material possessions, and typical teenage consumer culture. However, this connection is generally weaker than the others since Pearl doesn't appear in as many episodes and her character isn't as fully developed. According to this theory, the conflicts and relationships between the characters aren't just random personality clashes or comedic situations. Instead, they represent the inevitable tensions that arise when these fundamental moral failings are forced to coexist and interact with each other. The show becomes a study of how human vices create chaos and conflict when they're brought together in close proximity. Squidward as the tragic artist. A more sympathetic fan theory focuses specifically on Squidward and reframes him as a representation of the struggling artist in modern capitalist society. This interpretation suggests that Squidward isn't just a grumpy neighbor with an attitude problem. He's a genuinely talented creative person who's been systematically crushed by a culture and economic system that doesn't value artistic expression. Evidence for this theory comes from episodes that actually showcase Squidward's artistic abilities when he's given proper opportunities and audiences. His clarinet playing, while often mocked by other characters, demonstrates technical skill, emotional depth, and genuine musical knowledge. His sculptures and paintings, when viewed objectively, show sophisticated understanding of artistic principles, composition, and aesthetic theory. The theory suggests that Squidward's chronic bitterness and cynicism stem from being forced to work a menial service job at the Krusty Krab when he should be pursuing his artistic passions full-time. He's trapped in this position not because he lacks talent or ambition, but because the economic system doesn't provide sustainable ways for artists to focus on their craft without compromising their financial survival. SpongeBob and Patrick, in this reading, represent the dumbing down of popular culture and the triumph of commercialized entertainment over genuine artistic expression. They're satisfied with simple pleasures, mindless activities, and juvenile humor, preferring silly games and instant gratification to the complexity and nuance that characterizes real art. Their constant interruptions of Squidward's practice sessions and artistic endeavors aren't just neighborly annoyances. They're symbolic of how modern society actively discourages serious artistic pursuits in favor of immediate entertainment and consumer satisfaction. Every time they disrupt his clarinet practice or mock his artistic efforts, they're representing the broader cultural tendency to dismiss art as unnecessary or pretentious. Mr. Krabs represents the capitalist system that forces artists to compromise their integrity and waste their talents in order to survive economically. He doesn't care about Squidward's artistic ambitions, creative fulfillment, or personal growth. He only values productivity, customer satisfaction, and profit margins. Squidward is trapped in this job because he needs money to pay for basic necessities, not because the work provides any meaningful connection to his artistic goals. The theory explains why Squidward occasionally shows moments of genuine happiness and fulfillment, usually when he's able to engage with art, culture, or music in some meaningful way. These brief glimpses of joy suggest that underneath his cynical exterior, there's still an artist who believes in the transformative power of creativity and the importance of aesthetic beauty. Plankton as obsession and addiction. Another theory suggests that Plankton represents the destructive nature of obsession and addictive behavior. His single-minded focus on obtaining the Krabby Patty formula mirrors the behavioral patterns of someone caught in an addictive cycle that they can't break free from, regardless of the consequences to themselves or others. Plankton's entire existence revolves around one goal: getting the secret formula for Krabby Patties. He's willing to sacrifice everything: his business success, his relationships, his physical and mental health, his moral principles in pursuit of this single objective. This kind of all-consuming focus is characteristic of addictive behavior, where the addiction becomes more important than any other aspect of the person's life. The theory points to how Plankton's schemes become increasingly desperate and irrational over time, much like someone whose addiction is spiraling out of control. He takes bigger and bigger risks while becoming less capable of thinking clearly about the consequences of his actions. His plans often fail because he's so obsessed with the end goal that he can't rationally evaluate the means he's using to achieve it. His relationship with Karen, his computer wife, reflects patterns commonly seen in relationships affected by addiction. Karen often tries to help him, suggest alternatives to his obsessive schemes, or point out the flaws in his thinking, but he ignores her advice because it doesn't align with his fixation. She becomes frustrated and sometimes enabling, alternating between supporting his plans and expressing disapproval of his behavior. The Krabby Patty formula itself functions like a drug in this interpretation. It's something Plankton believes will solve all his problems and give him the happiness, success, and satisfaction he's looking for. The fact that he's never actually tried a Krabby Patty and doesn't know if he'd even enjoy it supports this reading. Like many addictive substances or behaviors, the appeal is more about the idea of what it represents than the actual experience itself. The mental hospital theory, one of the more controversial theories, suggests that the entire SpongeBob universe takes place in SpongeBob's imagination while he's a patient in a mental health facility. According to this interpretation, all the other characters are either fellow patients or staff members, and the underwater setting is an elaborate fantasy that SpongeBob has created to escape from his psychological issues and the reality of his situation. Proponents of this theory point to SpongeBob's childlike behavior, extreme mood swings, and apparent disconnection from normal adult responsibilities as evidence of serious mental health issues that might require institutional care. His inability to understand social boundaries, his obsessive behavior patterns, and his sometimes inappropriate reactions to situations could all be symptoms of various psychological conditions. Patrick in this reading represents another patient with intellectual or developmental disabilities, which would explain his limited cognitive abilities, simple worldview, and general confusion about how the world works. Squidward might be a long-term patient dealing with depression and cynicism, or possibly a staff member who's become burned out from working with difficult cases over an extended period. Mr. Krabs could represent the hospital administration or healthcare system focused primarily on profit margins and operational efficiency, rather than genuine patient care and therapeutic outcomes. His obsession with money might reflect how healthcare institutions often prioritize financial concerns over patient well-being and recovery. The theory suggests that the episodic nature of the show, where characters rarely seem to remember events from previous episodes and situations, tend to reset to a baseline state, reflects the memory issues and cognitive confusion that might accompany serious mental health conditions or the effects of psychiatric medication. Sandy Cheeks, as the only character who maintains a clear connection to the surface world and demonstrates consistent scientific knowledge, might represent SpongeBob's therapist, or a connection to reality that he's trying to maintain despite his psychological issues. The post-apocalyptic theory. Some fans believe that SpongeBob takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where human civilization has been destroyed and sea creatures have evolved to fill the ecological and social niches left vacant by extinct humans. This theory attempts to explain why the underwater world has so many human-like institutions, technologies, and cultural practices. According to this interpretation, the presence of cars, houses, restaurants, schools, government institutions, and other human inventions underwater suggests that these creatures have either inherited human artifacts or evolved to recreate human society in their own underwater environment. The strange physics and impossible geography of Bikini Bottom could be the result of massive environmental changes that occurred after the extinction of human civilization. The characters' human-like behavior, social structures, and cultural institutions support this theory. They have jobs, currency, legal systems, educational institutions, and entertainment industries that closely mirror human society but adapted for underwater life. This could represent sea creatures evolving to fill the social and ecological roles that humans once occupied. The purgatory theory. Another theory suggests that Bikini Bottom is actually a form of purgatory where souls work through their moral failings and character flaws before moving on to their final spiritual destination. This would explain why the characters never seem to age, grow, or fundamentally change despite experiencing countless adventures and learning opportunities. According to this interpretation, each character is stuck in Bikini Bottom because they need to learn specific moral lessons or overcome particular spiritual obstacles. SpongeBob's excessive enthusiasm and need for constant stimulation, Patrick's willful ignorance and laziness, Squidward's bitterness and anger, Mr. Krabs' greed and materialism, all of these represent spiritual failings that they need to address before they can progress to whatever comes next. The episodic nature of the show, where lessons are learned but quickly forgotten and characters return to their baseline personalities, could represent the cyclical nature of spiritual growth and the way people often need to face the same challenges repeatedly before they can truly internalize important life lessons. This theory reframes the show's consistently optimistic tone and the characters' general resilience as a form of cosmic mercy. Despite their obvious flaws and the chaos they create, the characters are given endless opportunities to grow, learn, and improve, surrounded by friends who care about them and situations that challenge them to become better versions of themselves. Part 6. SpongeBob and Internet Culture. SpongeBob's transformation into a cornerstone of internet culture represents one of the most fascinating examples of how children's media can evolve far beyond its original purpose. What started as a simple cartoon about a friendly sea sponge has become a universal language for online communication, a source of countless memes, and surprisingly, a foundation for genuinely creepy content that has nothing to do with the show's original wholesome intent. Quarantined Crab and Pandemic Parallels. The episode Quarantined Crab became one of the most eerily prophetic pieces of television ever created when it was pulled from broadcast schedules in 2020. The episode was written, animated, and completed long before anyone had heard of COVID-19, yet it predicted specific aspects of pandemic behavior with unsettling accuracy. The episode begins when a health inspector visits the Krusty Krab and discovers what he claims is evidence of a contagious illness. The restaurant is immediately placed under quarantine, with all customers and employees trapped inside until the health department can resolve the situation. What starts as a minor inconvenience quickly escalates into social chaos as the characters deal with uncertainty, isolation, and mounting fear. The early scenes of the episode feel almost documentary-like when viewed after experiencing an actual pandemic. The characters' initial reactions, confusion about the rules, questions about duration, attempts to maintain normal behavior despite abnormal circumstances mirror exactly how people responded to early COVID-19 restrictions and lockdown orders. As the episode progresses, the characters begin exhibiting behaviors that became familiar during real quarantine periods. They start hoarding food and supplies, forming factions and alliances based on perceived shared interests, spreading rumors and conspiracy theories about the true nature of their situation, and generally turning on each other as psychological stress and cabin fever take their toll. SpongeBob tries to maintain his characteristic optimism by organizing group activities and attempting to keep everyone's spirits up, but even he becomes affected by the mounting tension and social dysfunction. Patrick becomes more confused and demanding than usual, struggling to understand why he can't just leave whenever he wants. Squidward's existing misanthropy intensifies as he's forced into close proximity with people he already can't stand. The episode demonstrates how quickly social order can break down when people are confined together under stressful circumstances. Characters who normally get along reasonably well start arguing over trivial issues. Small disagreements escalate into major conflicts as everyone's patience wears thin. The shared crisis brings out both the best and worst aspects of each character's personality. One particularly prescient element is how the episode depicts the rapid spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories during times of crisis. Characters begin speculating about the real cause of their quarantine, questioning whether the health inspector is legitimate, and developing increasingly elaborate theories about what's really happening behind the scenes. These scenes feel like they were written specifically to comment on how social media handled pandemic information. The episode also captures the economic anxiety that comes with business shutdowns and economic uncertainty. Mr. Krabs becomes increasingly agitated about lost revenue, worried about how the quarantine will affect his business both short-term and long-term. This mirrors the real-world tension between public health measures and economic survival that dominated public discourse throughout the pandemic. When Nickelodeon made the decision to pull the episode from broadcast, it wasn't simply about avoiding potential controversy. The network recognized that airing content that so closely reflected viewers' real-life trauma and ongoing stress would be harmful rather than entertaining. The episode had accidentally become a painful reminder of experiences people were trying to escape when they turned to television for comfort. SpongeBob and Patrick's next adventure would involve their careless fun, accidentally ruining someone's important plans, and forcing them to learn what it's really like to live with the consequences. The Curse of Bikini Bottom shows how silly actions can create problems that seem fun at first, but become awful when you actually have to deal with them for a long time. What begins as SpongeBob and Patrick looking for something fun to do turns into a ghostly punishment that teaches them why some scary beings are so cranky about their lives. The episode starts with SpongeBob and Patrick lying around totally bored, looking for any kind of fun to fill their day. Their choice to look around Squidward's shed without asking shows how they try to solve being bored by going into other people's stuff. Patrick calling him Old Man Squidward shows how they see their neighbor as a grumpy old guy instead of trying to understand him. Finding the lawnmower in Squidward's shed makes them really curious since they don't know what the machine does. SpongeBob pretending to drive it and Patrick making sound effects shows how they act like little kids with new toys. When Squidward catches them sneaking around, their excuse that they're bored shows how they expect other people to fix their fun problems. Squidward's anger at finding them in his shed quickly changes into a sneaky chance when he realizes they want to play with his dangerous lawnmower. His daydream about them getting hurt by the machine shows his mean wish for payback against their constant bothering. Letting them use the lawnmower shows how his anger makes him want to see them get in trouble. SpongeBob and Patrick's wild ride on the lawnmower quickly goes crazy as they crash through Squidward's fence and head right toward the graveyard. Their continued laughing shows how they don't see the danger they're making or the stuff they're breaking. The lawnmower heading toward the cemetery sets up their crash with spooky forces. The Flying Dutchman getting ready for his first date in 400 years shows how important this night is to his usually lonely life. His careful picking of burial clothes and worry about how he looks shows his nervousness about romance after hundreds of years alone. The timing of SpongeBob and Patrick's crash couldn't be worse for messing up something so special to him. The repeated crashes that slowly shave off the Flying Dutchman's beard create growing damage to his looks and his chances for romantic success. Each hit removes more of his facial hair until he's totally clean-shaven, changing his scary ghost look into something that seems young and harmless. His fury at losing his scary beard shows how much his identity depends on looking frightening. SpongeBob and Patrick refusing to believe he's the Flying Dutchman because he has no beard adds hurt to injury by questioning Hooey Island. Their casual comment that he looks 1,000 years younger misses the point that he doesn't want to look young and friendly. The Dutchman's worry about maybe getting pimples again shows how much he likes his old, scary look. Learning that ghost beards take 1,000 years to grow back makes SpongeBob and Patrick's accident into a life-changing disaster for the Flying Dutchman. His choice to turn them into ghosts as punishment shows his attempt to make them understand what it feels like to have your normal life messed up. Patrick's complaint that ghostified isn't a real word shows their continued focus on silly details instead of serious results. SpongeBob and Patrick's initial excitement about becoming ghosts shows their total misunderstanding of what supernatural life actually involves. Their happy reactions and attempts to haunt Squidward fail completely when he simply sprays them with a hose. How easily their haunting gets ruined shows how being a ghost isn't as fun or powerful as they thought. The real problems of ghost life quickly become clear as SpongeBob can't hold his house key, falls through his bed, and ends up sleeping underground. Patrick's inability to close his eyes properly, and SpongeBob's tiredness from an uncomfortable night show how supernatural life creates constant daily troubles. Finding out that being a ghost makes normal activities impossible begins their education about consequences. SpongeBob's attempt to work at the Krusty Krab as a ghost shows how his new state makes him unable to do his beloved job. His inability to hold the spatula or pick up food shows how the punishment affects the thing he cares about most. The customer's fear and Mr. Krabs' acceptance as long as he can still cook creates pressure to do tasks that are now impossible. The breakdown when SpongeBob realizes he can't make Krabby Patties anymore represents the moment when the ghost change stops being fun and becomes really upsetting. Patrick's similar frustration with not being able to eat shows how their basic pleasures have been taken away. Their recognition that ghost life is awful rather than exciting marks their growing understanding of what they've done. Their return to the Flying Dutchman with desperate begging to be changed back shows how quickly their attitude has shifted from excitement to misery. SpongeBob's description of constantly moaning and groaning and living without a soul shows their new understanding of how hard supernatural life really island. The Flying Dutchman's satisfaction at their suffering shows that his punishment has achieved its teaching purpose. Learning that the curse can only be lifted when his beard grows back creates a seemingly impossible situation that forces SpongeBob and Patrick to find a creative solution. Their realization that the Flying Dutchman can't go on his date because of how he looks leads to their offering a makeover service. The various failed attempts at making a fake beard show their determination to fix the problem they created. The final solution of using SpongeBob himself as a living beard shows their willingness to make personal sacrifices to solve the problem. The Flying Dutchman's happiness with his new look and his departure for his date shows how their creative thinking has restored his romantic chances. The several months time jump reveals that their punishment lasted long enough to teach them lasting lessons about consequences. The final scene where the Flying Dutchman returns in panic because his girlfriend wants to marry him provides comic relief while showing that even supernatural beings have relationship problems. His fear of commitment, despite centuries of loneliness, adds humor while suggesting that some problems can't be solved by changing how you look. The episode teaches lessons about respecting other people's stuff, thinking before acting, and understanding that actions have results that might last much longer than expected. SpongeBob and Patrick's journey from boredom through reckless fun to miserable punishment, and finally to making amends, shows a complete cycle of learning from mistakes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While SpongeBob and Patrick's ghost punishment taught them about consequences, SpongeBob's next supernatural encounter would involve an unwanted houseguest who overstays his welcome and loses his scary abilities from getting too comfortable. Ghost Host shows how even helping someone can go too far when they take advantage of your kindness and refuse to leave. What begins as the Flying Dutchman needing a place to stay while his ship gets fixed turns into months of him living on SpongeBob's couch and losing his scary powers because life has become too easy and fun. The episode starts with the Flying Dutchman sailing through thick green fog that makes it hard to see where he's going. His crash into a cliff that completely destroys his ship creates the emergency that forces him to find somewhere to stay. The ship turning to dust shows how badly damaged it is and why he needs help from roadside assistance to get it fixed. SpongeBob's house becomes the Flying Dutchman's temporary home when he calls it a residence to the repair service. His dramatic entrance through the floor to scare SpongeBob shows his usual approach to frightening people. SpongeBob's terrified reaction of melting into a puddle inside his pants demonstrates the Flying Dutchman's effectiveness at his ghostly job of scaring people. SpongeBob's desperate attempts to get help from his neighbors reveal how alone he is in dealing with this scary situation. Squidward's refusal to help because he doesn't believe in ghosts shows his stubborn attitude, even when his friend needs assistance. Patrick's immediate fear that makes him slam his rock shut shows that some people are too scared to even hear about ghost problems. The Flying Dutchman's fake kindness toward Gary, followed by pretending to eat him, demonstrates his love of scaring people through cruel tricks. SpongeBob's horror at thinking his pet has been eaten shows how effective the Flying Dutchman's psychological tricks can be. Gary's safe return reveals that the ghost enjoys creating fear more than actually hurting anyone. The escalating haunting attempts include turning SpongeBob into an octopus while he sleeps, putting monsters in his refrigerator, making scary reflections in mirrors, and turning his cereal into blinking eyeballs. Each trick shows the Flying Dutchman's creativity in finding new ways to frighten his host. SpongeBob's initial terror gradually fades as he becomes used to these supernatural pranks. The Flying Dutchman's frustration when SpongeBob stops being scared reveals how much his identity depends on successfully frightening people. His attempt to scare SpongeBob with increasingly extreme transformations, including cockroaches, clowns, and spiders, shows his desperation to get a reaction. SpongeBob's casual question about how much longer this will take shows he's become completely immune to the scares. The Flying Dutchman's admission that he's been doing the same scary tricks for years and that scaring is a young man's game reveals his crisis of confidence about his abilities. His decision to give up the ghost shows how devastating it is for him to lose his effectiveness at his main purpose in Afterlife. SpongeBob's attempt to reassure him that he's just gotten used to the scares doesn't help the ghost's wounded pride. The failed attempts to scare other people, including a sleeping mattress customer and a little girl with a jump rope, confirm that the Flying Dutchman has lost his scary touch with everyone, not just SpongeBob. His declaration that he's not scary anymore represents a complete loss of professional identity. SpongeBob's suggestion that he just needs a break seems like reasonable advice for someone having work problems. The Flying Dutchman's request to stay just a little while longer on SpongeBob's comfy couch in a pineapple sets up the long-term housing situation that will become problematic. The 6-month time jump reveals how a temporary favor has turned into permanent residence. SpongeBob's shocked discovery of ghost friends partying in his house shows how the situation has gotten completely out of hand. The party scene with multiple ghosts drinking, riding motorcycles down the stairs, and generally trashing SpongeBob's home shows how the Flying Dutchman's recovery has involved abandoning his scary duties entirely. His casual conversation about shared interests in teddy bears and ponies shows how comfortable and non-threatening he's become. The wedding ring he throws away suggests he's even abandoned his romantic commitments. SpongeBob's firm demand that everyone leave shows his recognition that the helping situation has gone too far and needs to end. His confrontation with the Flying Dutchman about spending eternity on this couch represents his attempt to motivate his house guest to return to normal life. The ghost's admission that the couch is comfy shows how contentment has made him lazy about his responsibilities. The motivational video with The Power Within represents SpongeBob's attempt to help the Flying Dutchman regain his confidence and sense of purpose. The Flying Dutchman's emotional reaction to the self-help content shows how much he's lost touch with his inner strength. SpongeBob's demand that he get off the couch and get serious represents tough love aimed at ending the enabling relationship. The practice scaring sessions, where they target an old lady and Larry at the gym, show SpongeBob's commitment to helping his friend regain his skills. The failures with both targets, where the old lady mistakes him for Lonnie and Larry interprets the scare as fitness motivation, show that the problem goes beyond just confidence. The Flying Dutchman's conclusion that people just don't believe in ghosts anymore identifies a deeper cultural shift. SpongeBob's solution involving Squidward shows his understanding that the Flying Dutchman needs to scare someone who doesn't expect it. The elaborate haunting using Squidward's mother's guilt about phone calls demonstrates creative psychological manipulation. The progression from guilt trip to clarinet transformation to full ghostly revelation shows a sophisticated approach to breaking down disbelief. Squidward's terrified reaction and public declaration about ghosts shows that the Flying Dutchman has successfully regained his scary abilities. His restored confidence and enthusiasm for ruining more souls demonstrates that the rehabilitation has worked. The confession that his ship has been repaired for 3 months reveals that he's been taking advantage of SpongeBob's kindness long after it was necessary. The final gift that appears to eat SpongeBob shows the Flying Dutchman's return to his mischievous nature, though SpongeBob's laughter suggests it's another harmless prank. This ending maintains their friendship while establishing that the Flying Dutchman is back to his normal ghostly duties. The episode teaches lessons about setting boundaries when helping others, recognizing when temporary assistance becomes permanent dependence, and understanding that sometimes tough love is necessary to motivate people to return to their responsibilities. While the Flying Dutchman learned to regain his scary abilities with SpongeBob's help, Mr. Krabs' next supernatural encounter would involve making a deal that seems perfect at first, but turns into a nightmare when he gets exactly what he asked for. Money Talks shows how getting your biggest wish can become your worst problem when you don't think about what it really means. What begins as Mr. Plain. Krabs wanting to communicate with his beloved money turns into constant demands from bills and coins that want to be spent rather than saved. The episode starts at the Krusty Krab, where a customer offers Mr. Krabs $5 to get a table faster by kicking out the current customers. SpongeBob's confusion about how money could help people chew faster shows his innocence about how bribes work. Mr. Krabs' immediate willingness to throw out the elderly customers for a small payment reveals how money controls his decisions. SpongeBob's literal interpretation of money talks leads him to actually try talking to the dollar bill, asking what it has against old people. Mr. Krabs' explanation that only fish can really talk sets up the contrast with what's about to happen. SpongeBob's wish that money could actually talk gives Mr. Krabs the idea that starts his supernatural journey. Mr. Krabs' musical number about talking to money reveals his fantasy about having a perfect relationship with his greatest love. His vision of telling secrets, bathing in riches, and being best friends forever shows how he imagines money as the ideal companion. The song demonstrates his complete obsession with wealth and his belief that communication would solve all his problems. At home, Mr. Krabs tries different languages and methods to make his money talk, including French, Spanish, and Pig Latin. His emotional breakdown, where he cries and says he would give anything to talk to money, creates the opening for supernatural intervention. The Flying Dutchman's appearance shows how desperate wishes can attract dangerous attention. Mr. Krabs' casual attitude towards selling his soul reveals how often he's made such deals before. His impatience with the Flying Dutchman's warning speech and his demand to skip the lecture shows how greed makes him ignore obvious red flags. The signed contract represents his willingness to pay any price for what he wants. The immediate success of the wish when a nickel starts talking seems to prove that Mr. Krabs got a great deal. The nickel's complaint about being stuck in his belly button during a coin shower reveals disgusting details about Mr. Krabs' relationship with money. The dollar bill's comment about his tooth hygiene shows that even money finds him repulsive. At the Krusty Krab the next day, Mr. Krabs' public displays of affection toward his money become embarrassing as he kisses bills and talks to them lovingly. The money in the cash register trying to escape and yelling, "Jump out," shows that his employee money doesn't want to stay with him. Squidward's concern about his paycheck reveals how Mr. Krabs' new behavior affects his workers. The revelation that money wants to be spent, rather than saved completely, destroys Mr. Krabs' fantasy about their relationship. The individual bills, specific spending requests for fairy princess outfits, corn dogs, and diapers represent everything Mr. Krabs hates about losing money. Their argument that it's in our nature to be spent shows how he misunderstood what money actually wants. The shopping trip where Mr. Krabs is forced to buy and wear the ridiculous items his money demands represents the ultimate humiliation for someone who values his dignity and his wealth. His tears while wearing fairy princess outfits and diapers shows how completely the wish has backfired. SpongeBob and Patrick's casual acceptance of the situation while dressed similarly adds to his embarrassment. Back home, the money's constant chanting of "spend us" becomes psychological torture that drives Mr. Krabs to exhaustion and desperation. His accusation that they're shallow and self-absorbed reveals his disappointment that money doesn't share his values. The irony that he can't stand the very thing he loves most shows how poorly he understood his own desires. SpongeBob's welfare check on Mr. Krabs leads to the moment where he tries to get rid of the money by giving it away, only to immediately take it back. This shows how his addiction to wealth conflicts with his need for peace. His bloodshot eyes and nervous behavior reveal how the constant demands have affected his mental health. Mr. Krabs' desperate plea to the Flying Dutchman for a refund gets rejected because all sales are final. The Flying Dutchman's comment about Mr. Krabs being a selfish shellfish explains why he doesn't deserve sympathy for his situation. The attempt to collect his soul as payment shows that supernatural deals always come with serious consequences. The discovery that Mr. Krabs has already sold his soul to multiple other entities creates a line of supernatural debt collectors all waiting to claim him. Each monster's claim on his soul shows how his greed has led him to make numerous dangerous deals. The Flying Dutchman having to wait in line like everyone else adds humor while showing how common Mr. Krabs' soul selling has become. SpongeBob's presence in the debt collection line because Mr. Krabs was $5 short on payday reveals how his cheapness extends even to selling his employees' souls. This final revelation shows that his greed affects not just himself, but everyone around him. The Flying Dutchman's disappointed sigh suggests that even supernatural beings are tired of Mr. Krabs' behavior. The episode teaches lessons about being careful what you wish for, understanding that getting what you want might not bring happiness, and recognizing that relationships based purely on selfish desires are doomed to fail. Mr. Krabs' journey from excited wishmaker to tortured soul seller shows how greed can turn blessings into curses. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While Mr. Krabs' wish to talk to money turned into a nightmare of constant spending demands, Squidward's next crisis would involve his stubborn refusal to try something everyone loves, leading to a secret addiction that spirals completely out of control. Just One Bite shows how pride can make people refuse to admit when they're wrong, and how trying to hide mistakes can make problems much worse. What begins as Squidward insisting he hates Krabby Patties without ever trying, one turns into a desperate midnight break-in when he discovers how delicious they really are. The episode starts at the Krusty Krab, with Squidward serving a customer an extremely unhealthy-looking burger covered in batter and stuck on a stick. His disgusted comments about customers eating garbage reveals his snobbish attitude toward the food he serves every day. When he declares that he hates Krabby Patties, SpongeBob thinks it's just a joke because the idea seems impossible to him. SpongeBob's shock at learning Squidward has never actually tasted a Krabby Patty leads him to consult a dictionary to see if such words can even go together in a sentence. The customers chant that the only people who don't like a Krabby Patty have never tasted one, sets up the central truth that Squidward is judging something without any real knowledge. His stubborn insistence that he never will try one shows how pride can make people resist new experiences. SpongeBob's increasingly desperate attempts to get Squidward to try just one bite include magic tricks, baby food methods, and following him everywhere with patties. Squidward's extreme reactions, including his claim that he would eat his own legs first if trapped with only a Krabby Patty, show how committed he is to his position. The dramatic background changes when SpongeBob talks about food being good for your soul versus Squidward claiming to have no soul, add humor while showing their different worldviews. Squidward's escape attempts to the bathroom, sink, cash register, and trash can all fail as SpongeBob appears everywhere with more patties. The handcuffing scene where SpongeBob literally attaches himself to Squidward shows how far his determination goes. When Squidward finally gives in and takes one tiny bite, his initial smile shows that he immediately knows how wrong he's been. Squidward's fake outrage where he calls the patty horrible, putrid, poorly prepared, vile, unappetizing, and disgusting represents his desperate attempt to save face after realizing his mistake. His dramatic stomping and burial of the patty with a tombstone shows how far he'll go to maintain his stubborn position. SpongeBob's confusion about how anyone could resist the absolute good of a Krabby Patty shows his innocent belief in universal truths. The moment SpongeBob goes inside, Squidward immediately digs up the buried patty and devours it while crying about all the wasted years. His realization that he's been missing out on something wonderful creates instant regret and craving. His decision that he needs to sneak more patties shows how his pride prevents him from simply admitting his mistake to SpongeBob. Squidward's attempt to order a triple Krabby Supreme while acting casual shows his desperation to get more food while maintaining his fake hatred. SpongeBob's sincere apology for pushing the patty on him, combined with his acceptance that people can like different things, represents genuine wisdom and kindness. The irony that SpongeBob learns tolerance just as Squidward discovers his craving creates perfect dramatic timing. When SpongeBob takes away the patty because he wants to see the customer's face, Squidward's burnt face from falling on the grill shows how his desperate grabbing leads to pain. SpongeBob's decision to eat the unclaimed patty himself represents the ultimate torture for the now addicted Squidward. The casual comment that he hasn't had one in over 20 minutes shows how normal and frequent Krabby Patty eating is for SpongeBob. Squidward's consideration of eating from the garbage shows how low his craving has brought him. When he actually dives into the trash and eats everything except the patty he wanted, it demonstrates how addiction can make people do disgusting things they never thought they would. SpongeBob's decision to cremate the garbage patty by throwing it in the furnace eliminates Squidward's last hope for an easy fix. The dream sequence where Squidward imagines a romantic relationship with a giant Krabby Patty, including marriage and growing old together, shows how his craving has become an obsession that fills his sleeping thoughts. This represents how forbidden things can become more desirable than they really should be. His waking confusion about calling for honey shows how deeply the fantasy affected him. Squidward's midnight break-in attempt at the Krusty Krab shows how desperation drives him to criminal behavior. The elaborate security system with gas and fire that burns him twice demonstrates Mr. Krab's serious approach to protecting his business. The fact that it's designed to stop burglars, but Squidward triggers it anyway, shows how his craving has made him act like a real criminal. The discovery of the patty vault filled with hundreds of Krabby Patties represents the ultimate temptation for someone with Squidward's new addiction. SpongeBob's 3 a.m. appearance to Count Sesame Seeds shows his dedication to his job and creates the worst possible timing for Squidward's criminal activity. The series of questions about why Squidward is there, why the vault is open, and why he's holding a patty builds tension toward his inevitable confession. Squidward's final breakdown, where he admits, "I love Krabby Patties," represents the complete collapse of his stubborn position. His immediate binge eating of dozens of patties in various ways shows how suppressed desires can explode when finally released. SpongeBob's warning about the patties going to his thighs creates body image anxiety that leads to the explosive finale. The explosion of the Krusty Krab and Squidward ending up in pieces in an ambulance provides an extreme consequence for overindulgence. The paramedic's casual comment about remembering his first Krabby Patty suggests this kind of extreme reaction might be more common than expected, adding dark humor to the ending. The episode teaches lessons about the dangers of stubborn pride, the importance of trying new things before judging them, and how hiding mistakes can lead to bigger problems. However, it's important to note that the extreme binge eating shown here represents unhealthy behavior that could be harmful if copied in real life. The story works as comedy, but shouldn't be seen as a guide for dealing with food or cravings in healthy ways. While Squidward's stubborn pride led to a dangerous binge eating problem, Patrick's next adventure would involve befriending a dangerous creature whose destructive nature creates chaos even when he means well. The Monster Who Came to Bikini Bottom shows how good intentions can still cause harm when you don't think about the consequences of your actions. What begins as Patrick making an innocent friend turns into widespread property damage when he doesn't realize that some beings are too big and strong to safely interact with normal society. The episode starts with Patrick collecting items in what appears to be a junkyard or waste area, showing his simple pleasure in finding random objects. His discovery of a rubber stopper that releases toxic waste when removed demonstrates his lack of awareness about dangerous materials. When he finds a snow globe and plays with it, his innocent enjoyment attracts the attention of a giant purple monster who becomes interested in the simple toy. Patrick's immediate acceptance of the monster shows his natural friendliness and lack of fear toward things that would terrify most people. When the monster takes his snow globe, Patrick doesn't get angry, but instead teaches him how to use it properly by turning it upside down. This moment of sharing creates a bond between them based on simple pleasures and mutual enjoyment. The friendship develops through basic activities like smelling each other's armpits and playing simple games, showing how Patrick connects with others through childlike fun rather than complex social interactions. When Patrick tries to teach the monster hide and seek, his explanation shows his patience in helping his new friend learn new activities. The monster's confusion about the rules demonstrates how different their backgrounds are. Patrick's decision to introduce the monster to SpongeBob reveals his desire to include his friend in his social circle, not realizing the potential problems this might cause. The monster carrying Patrick in his mouth during transport shows the size difference between them and hints at the danger, though Patrick sees it as fun rather than threatening. His casual comment about playing more coral ring toss later shows how normal this extreme situation feels to him. SpongeBob's panic at seeing Patrick inside the monster's mouth demonstrates a normal fear response to what appears to be a dangerous situation. His assumption that Patrick is crying out for help contrasts with Patrick's actual enjoyment, showing how different people can interpret the same situation completely differently. The flashback to SpongeBob's emotional breakdown over a broken ice machine reveals his tendency to overreact to problems. When Patrick introduces his friends, the awkward moment where he forgets the monster's name creates social tension that SpongeBob tries to solve with helpful suggestions. The monster's growling response becomes his name as SpongeBob interprets it as Mr. Rarg, showing how communication can work even without shared language. This moment establishes the monster as part of their friend group despite the obvious size and species differences. Patrick's generous offer to let the monster live under his rock demonstrates his sharing nature and desire to help his homeless friend. However, when the monster puts the rock on his head and then throws it, breaking it into pieces, the first signs of the destruction problem become apparent. Everyone's laughter at the broken house shows how they're treating serious property damage as entertainment. The escalation to smashing SpongeBob's pineapple house creates real danger as Gary has to parachute to safety. SpongeBob's concern for his pet shows appropriate fear, while Patrick's continued excitement about the destruction reveals his disconnect from the seriousness of the situation. The monster's actions appear playful rather than malicious, but the results are equally devastating regardless of intent. The destruction of Squidward's house while he's away creates the biggest property damage yet, leaving him homeless when he returns from work. The arrival of police cars and the installation of barbed wire fencing shows how the authorities view the monster as a genuine threat requiring containment. Patrick's description of it as a cute little fence demonstrates his failure to understand the security measures. Squidward's discovery that his home has been reduced to a pile of gravel creates genuine trauma for someone who just wanted to come home after work. His threat to throw a horrible tantrum shows how the property damage has affected an innocent victim who had nothing to do with the situation. The police officer's casual attitude about his housing loss adds insult to injury. The monster's escape from police containment when an officer sneezes into a megaphone shows how easily frightened he becomes despite his massive size. His flight into town creates a public safety emergency that affects the entire community. The chase scene with police cars getting squished demonstrates how his size makes him dangerous, even when he's trying to escape rather than fight. The confrontation at the magazine stand reveals the monster's gentle nature as he quietly reads rather than causing more destruction. However, the police officer's determination to remove him shows how his presence creates fear regardless of his current behavior. Patrick's brave attempt to defend his friend by standing in front of him demonstrates loyalty, but also shows his continued failure to understand the real problems. Patrick's private conversation with the monster using formal, poetic language about friendship having to end as the setting sun shows surprising wisdom about difficult goodbyes. His ability to communicate complex ideas to the monster suggests their friendship involved more understanding than was initially apparent. The emotional impact on both Patrick and the police officers shows how genuine their connection was. The solution where the monster moves to a snowy mountain but continues helping with the ice machine problem shows creative problem solving that benefits everyone. The monster's remote ice crushing service allows him to be useful while staying away from populated areas where his size causes problems. This arrangement respects both his desire to help and the community's need for safety. The episode teaches lessons about accepting differences in others, finding creative solutions to problems, and recognizing when good intentions need to be balanced with practical safety concerns. Patrick's friendship with the monster shows that connections can form across any differences, but also demonstrates that some relationships need special arrangements to work safely for everyone involved. The story also shows how important it is to think about consequences before acting, even when you mean well, and how sometimes caring about someone means making difficult choices about what's best for them and others around them. While Patrick's friendship with a monster caused property damage through good intentions, SpongeBob and Patrick's next adventure would involve ignoring clear warnings and entering a dangerous situation that gets worse every time they try to fix their mistakes. Survival of the Idiots shows how refusing to listen to instructions and ignoring warning signs can turn a small problem into a much bigger disaster. What begins as SpongeBob and Patrick wanting to visit Sandy during her winter sleep turns into them getting trapped and making increasingly bad choices to survive. The episode starts with SpongeBob and Patrick excitedly running to visit Sandy, only to find her tree dome covered with metal walls and a keep out sign. Sandy's video message clearly explains that she's hibernating for the winter and doesn't want to be bothered, specifically warning SpongeBob not to disturb her. This sets up the central conflict between following rules and giving in to curiosity. Patrick's philosophy that no means yes represents dangerous thinking that ignores other people's boundaries and clear instructions. His decision to drain the water from the entrance and enter anyway shows how some people will find ways around rules they don't want to follow. SpongeBob's initial reluctance gets quickly overcome by Patrick's pushiness and the appeal of the snow inside. The discovery of snow inside the tree dome creates wonder and excitement for SpongeBob and Patrick, who have never experienced winter weather before. Patrick's poetic description of the snow comes from reading a candy bar wrapper, showing how he sometimes sounds wise by accident rather than actual knowledge. Their decision to remove their water helmets because snow is frozen, water demonstrates poor understanding of safety equipment. Finding Sandy in her hibernation form, looking like a bear and much larger than usual, should have been a warning that she's in a different state than normal. Patrick's joke about beauty sleep and their decision to play along with her dream talking shows their failure to recognize the seriousness of her condition. Sandy's dream about chasing outlaws gives them the idea to roleplay as the criminals she's dreaming about. Their game of pretending to be Dirty Dan and Pinhead Larry starts as harmless fun, but quickly wakes Sandy up and triggers her protective hibernation reflexes. Her extreme anger and physical violence toward them represents the natural defensive behavior of animals who are disturbed during hibernation. SpongeBob's attempts to remind her who they are fail because hibernating animals operate on instinct rather than memory. The temporary solution of using Patrick's belly button lint as earmuffs seems to work at first, allowing them to make noise without waking Sandy again. However, their testing of the earmuffs with increasingly loud sounds shows how they push boundaries even when they think they're being safe. The megaphone test reveals that the earmuffs aren't completely soundproof but gives them false confidence. Their outdoor snow fight escalates from simple snowball throwing to using giant snow cannons and weapons, showing how competitive games can become dangerous when participants keep trying to outdo each other. The argument over who gets to be Dirty Dan leads to them hitting each other with snow tools, creating enough noise and vibration to knock off Sandy's earmuffs and wake her again. Sandy's second awakening results in even more violent behavior as she fully enters her hibernation defense mode, treating them as genuine threats rather than friends. Her demand to know which one is the real Dirty Dan creates a life-threatening situation where any answer could be wrong. Patrick's honest admission gets him immediately attacked, showing that honesty isn't always the best policy in dangerous situations. The chase scene where Sandy pursues SpongeBob around the tree dome demonstrates how hibernating animals can be incredibly dangerous when defending their territory. SpongeBob's attempts to reason with her fail completely because she's operating on pure instinct. The mock gravestones for Dirty Dan and Pinhead Larry show how close they came to serious harm. The discovery that the door is frozen shut traps them inside for the entire winter, turning their brief visit into a survival situation. Patrick's attempt to open the door by saying "Open Sesame" shows his continued reliance on magical thinking rather than practical solutions. Their realization that they're stuck until spring creates genuine panic about long-term survival. The extreme cold that follows makes them desperate enough to consider burning Sandy's tree for warmth, which would destroy her home and probably kill her. Sandy's unconscious threats, even while sleeping, prevent them from taking this drastic step. They're suffering from hypothermia, shown through blue skin and frozen body parts, demonstrates real physical danger. The decision to steal Sandy's fur represents their most desperate and selfish choice, prioritizing their immediate comfort over Sandy's well-being. Patrick's use of duct tape to rip out large patches of fur shows escalating theft that will leave Sandy defenseless against cold when she wakes up. Their satisfaction with their stolen warmth shows how desperation can make people rationalize harmful behavior. The ironic timing of spring arriving just as they finish stealing Sandy's fur creates the worst possible outcome: Sandy's Sandy. They no longer need the warmth, but Sandy wakes up to discover her fur is gone. Her horror at finding herself bald creates genuine trauma for someone who needs her fur for protection and identity. SpongeBob's casual comment about squirrel pattern baldness shows his complete failure to understand the seriousness of what they've done. The punishment where SpongeBob and Patrick must serve as Sandy's living fur coat until her real fur grows back provides appropriate consequences for their theft. Their position as human clothing forces them to experience discomfort while helping Sandy, though this consequence is relatively mild compared to the harm they caused. Sandy's cheerful attitude about spring while they suffer shows how she's moved past anger to practical problem solving. The episode teaches important lessons about respecting other people's boundaries, following safety instructions, and thinking about consequences before acting. However, it's worth noting that some of the behaviors shown, particularly the violence and the fur theft, represent extreme situations that shouldn't be copied in real life. The story works as comedy but demonstrates how poor decision-making can escalate simple problems into serious dangers. The episode also shows how curiosity and friendship can lead people into trouble when they override good judgment, and how trying to fix mistakes with more bad choices usually makes situations worse rather than better. Gross out frames and meme evolution. SpongeBob's contribution to internet gross out culture is both extensive and culturally significant. The show's animation style, which can shift seamlessly between simple cartoon aesthetics and detailed, realistic artwork, depending on comedic requirements, has produced some of the most memorable and widely shared disturbing images in internet history. These gross-out frames work as memes because they create such a strong contrast with viewers' expectations. People associate SpongeBob with cute, simple character designs and wholesome content. When the animation suddenly becomes hyper-realistic, anatomically detailed, or grotesquely distorted, it creates a cognitive shock that's both funny and deeply unsettling. The most famous examples have become foundational to internet culture. SpongeBob's detailed pores and facial hair during extreme close-ups, Patrick's realistic human-like teeth, Squidward's impossibly distorted expressions during moments of extreme emotion, and various characters' anatomically impossible facial contortions during physical comedy sequences. All of these have been extracted from their original context and transformed into reaction images, meme templates, and standalone art pieces. What makes these images particularly effective is how they've been divorced from their original narrative purpose. When you encounter a grotesquely detailed image of SpongeBob's face as a standalone post on social media, it's much more jarring than when it appears for a fraction of a second during a comedic sequence where it serves a specific storytelling function. The internet has created entire communities dedicated to collecting, cataloging, and creating new cursed SpongeBob content. These communities have developed their own aesthetic standards and informal rules about what makes an image effectively cursed versus just randomly weird or distorted. Cursed, SpongeBob edits, and fan creations. Beyond the official gross-out frames that come directly from episodes, internet culture has produced an enormous amount of fan-created cursed SpongeBob content. These range from simple photo manipulations to sophisticated digital art pieces that transform familiar characters into something genuinely unsettling. Some of the most popular categories include realistic SpongeBob art, where digital artists create anatomically correct, human-like versions of the characters while maintaining their essential personality traits. These images are disturbing because they preserve the characters' familiar expressions and mannerisms while giving them human anatomy that makes them look genuinely threatening or unnatural. Another major trend involves placing SpongeBob characters in contexts that are completely inappropriate for children's media horror movie scenarios, adult situations, or real-world settings where cartoon characters would be disturbing rather than charming. These edits force viewers to confront the strangeness of their emotional attachment to fictional characters. The distorted audio movement has also significantly affected SpongeBob content. Creators slow down, speed up, pitch shift, or otherwise manipulate audio from episodes to create unsettling soundscapes that accompany visual edits. These audio manipulations can make familiar dialogue sound threatening, alien, or genuinely disturbing. The technical sophistication of these edits has increased dramatically as digital tools have become more accessible and powerful. Early cursed SpongeBob content was often simple photo manipulation using basic editing software. Modern creators use advanced video editing programs, AI-powered tools, and professional-grade audio software to create content that can be genuinely convincing and deeply unsettling. SpongeBob as universal internet language. One of the most remarkable aspects of SpongeBob's internet presence is how it has evolved into a universal language for online communication. SpongeBob memes and references transcend cultural, linguistic, and geographic boundaries in ways that very few other pieces of media have achieved. The mocking SpongeBob meme perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. The image of SpongeBob making a silly face has become a universally understood way to indicate sarcasm or mockery in online communication. The visual perfectly captures the tone of repeating someone's words in a mocking voice, and it works across different languages and cultural contexts. SpongeBob reaction images have become so embedded in internet culture that they're often more effective at conveying complex emotions than written language. A well-chosen SpongeBob screenshot can communicate frustration, excitement, confusion, exhaustion, or any number of other emotional states with an immediacy and universality that text alone cannot match. The time cards from SpongeBob episodes Later, Meanwhile, The Next Day, One Eternity Later have become versatile meme formats that can be adapted to virtually any situation. People create edited versions of these cards to comment on everything from personal procrastination to global events, and they work because they provide a familiar visual framework that can be applied to almost any concept. This universality has made SpongeBob a kind of cultural lingua franca for internet communication. People who don't speak the same language can still communicate through shared understanding of SpongeBob content. The characters' expressions and situations are expressive enough that they convey meaning even without context from the original show. Viral horror content and fan films. The internet's fascination with transforming SpongeBob into horror content has produced some genuinely effective, scary material. Talented creators have used SpongeBob as source material for horror films, digital art, and video projects that work as legitimate horror content, not just as novelty items or internet curiosities. Some creators have recut SpongeBob episodes to emphasize their existing creepy elements, removing comedic timing and sound effects while enhancing atmospheric elements to create genuine horror experiences. These edits often focus on episodes that were already somewhat unsettling, like Graveyard Shift or Rock Bottom, but present them in ways that emphasize fear and tension rather than humor and resolution. Fan artists have created elaborate SpongeBob horror art that reimagines the characters as genuinely threatening creatures, while maintaining enough of their original characteristics to be recognizable. These aren't just simple evil SpongeBob drawings, they're sophisticated horror art pieces that happen to use SpongeBob as inspiration, often incorporating elements of body horror, cosmic horror, or psychological thriller aesthetics. Video creators have also produced SpongeBob horror content using various techniques and production approaches. Some use traditional animation to create new SpongeBob content with explicit horror themes. Others use live-action techniques to bring SpongeBob characters into real-world settings in ways that are genuinely unsettling. Still others use found footage or analog horror techniques to create the impression that they've discovered disturbing SpongeBob content that was hidden or suppressed. The technical quality of this fan-created horror content often rivals or exceeds professional productions. Creators use industry-standard software, sophisticated visual effects, and advanced audio design to create content that's genuinely frightening and technically impressive. The psychology of subverting childhood content. The popularity of cursed and horror SpongeBob content raises interesting questions about why people are drawn to seeing familiar, comforting things transformed into something disturbing or threatening. There seems to be something particularly satisfying about taking childhood nostalgia and subverting it in ways that challenge expectations and comfort levels. Part of the appeal might be the cognitive dissonance created when something associated with safety and innocence is presented as dangerous or threatening. SpongeBob represents simplicity and wholesomeness for many people, so seeing those characters in menacing contexts creates a mental shock that can be both humorous and unsettling depending on the execution and the viewer's perspective. The phenomenon might also represent a way of processing the disconnect between childhood experiences and adult realities. By transforming childhood media into something dark or surreal, creators and consumers might be working through the realization that the world is more complex and potentially threatening than they understood when they were young. There's also an element of creative rebellion in cursed content that represents a form of artistic transgression. Taking something that was created specifically for children and transforming it into something inappropriate or unsettling allows people to claim ownership over cultural content and reshape it to serve their own purposes rather than corporate interests. SpongeBob's global cultural impact. SpongeBob's influence on internet culture extends far beyond English-speaking countries and Western cultural contexts. The show has been translated into dozens of languages and adapted for different cultural markets, but the internet has created a global SpongeBob culture that transcends these localized adaptations. SpongeBob memes appear in languages and cultural contexts that have no direct connection to the original American cartoon. The characters have become universal symbols that can be used to communicate emotions and ideas across cultural and linguistic boundaries that would normally prevent such communication. This global reach has created interesting situations where SpongeBob references appear in political movements, social media trends, and cultural conversations that have nothing to do with children's entertainment. The characters have been adopted by various communities and movements as symbols and communication tools for purposes that the original creators never intended or anticipated. The international nature of SpongeBob internet culture has also led to fascinating cross-cultural exchanges, where different countries and communities contribute their own interpretations and creative additions to the global conversation around the show. The commercialization of SpongeBob memes. As SpongeBob memes have become more mainstream and culturally significant, there have been increasing attempts to commercialize and monetize this internet culture. Official SpongeBob social media accounts now regularly post meme-style content, and merchandise based on popular memes has become a significant part of the franchise's commercial strategy. This commercialization has created tension between organic fan culture and corporate attempts to profit from internet trends. Some fans feel that official adoption of meme culture diminishes its authenticity and represents an attempt by corporations to co-opt and control creative expressions that were originally grassroots and independent. The relationship between fan-created content and official SpongeBob products continues to evolve as internet culture becomes more influential in mainstream media and marketing. The success of fan-created content has influenced official SpongeBob productions, while corporate involvement has shaped how fans create and share content. SpongeBob and the evolution of internet humor. SpongeBob's role in internet culture also reflects broader changes in how humor functions online and how people communicate through digital media. The show's absurdist elements, flexible format, and memorable characters make it perfect for the kind of surreal, context-free humor that dominates social media platforms. The way SpongeBob content gets remixed, edited, and transformed reflects the collaborative and participatory nature of internet culture. Instead of being passive consumers of media, people actively reshape and recontextualize content to serve their own communicative and creative purposes. SpongeBob's influence on internet humor extends beyond just providing source material for memes. The show's approach to absurdist comedy, its willingness to embrace weirdness, and its ability to find humor in mundane situations has influenced how other content creators approach online entertainment and communication. Outrow, spooky but still SpongeBob. After spending these past 2 hours exploring the darker, weirder, and more unsettling corners of SpongeBob SquarePants, it's important to step back and remember what makes this show truly special. Yes, we've covered episodes that genuinely scared children, animation that was probably too detailed for its own good, psychological themes that felt surprisingly mature, content that networks decided was inappropriate, fan theories that reframe the entire show as something much darker, and internet culture that has transformed innocent cartoon characters into sources of genuine unease. But here's the remarkable thing about SpongeBob. None of these creepy elements actually diminish what the show fundamentally represents. At its core, SpongeBob SquarePants remains a celebration of optimism, friendship, creativity, and finding joy in everyday experiences. Even in its strangest or most unsettling moments, there's usually that essential SpongeBob spirit that keeps everything anchored to something positive and life-affirming. SpongeBob's laugh still echoes through Bikini Bottom with the same infectious enthusiasm it's always had. Patrick's well-meaning confusion still provides a kind of innocent comfort that reminds us not everything in life needs to be complicated or analyzed. Even Squidward, despite all his suffering and existential angst, continues to find occasional moments of genuine happiness that suggest hope is always possible. The scary episodes we've discussed work precisely because they're exceptions to SpongeBob's normal tone. Graveyard Shift is memorable because most SpongeBob episodes are content to be lighthearted and fun, without needing to invoke supernatural horror. Face Freeze sticks with viewers because SpongeBob characters are usually designed to be appealing and cute, not grotesque and nightmare-inducing. The psychological complexity of episodes like SB-129 feels significant because most of the show operates on a much simpler emotional level, where problems can be solved through friendship and understanding. SpongeBob's occasional ventures into stranger territory actually make the show more resilient and meaningful rather than less. By acknowledging that life can sometimes be confusing, scary, or overwhelming, the show earns the right to its optimism. SpongeBob's happiness feels authentic because it coexists with genuine challenges. His friendships feel valuable because we've seen what loneliness and isolation look like. The vibrant, chaotic community of Bikini Bottom feels precious because we've glimpsed what emptiness and disconnection can do to people. The fan theories and internet culture surrounding SpongeBob's darker moments actually demonstrate how deeply the show has connected with people across different generations and cultural contexts. You don't create elaborate theories about nuclear testing or mental illness for shows you don't care about. You don't spend time and creative energy making cursed content from media that doesn't hold significant meaning in your life. The very existence of all this dark interpretation and creepy fan content is actually a testament to how much SpongeBob means to people and how much creative potential they see in its universe. There's also something beautifully democratic about how SpongeBob has been transformed by internet culture. The show's creators couldn't have predicted that screen caps from Face Freeze would become fundamental building blocks of meme culture, or that fans would develop sophisticated theories about the psychological symbolism of the main characters, or that people would create entire horror art movements based on making familiar characters look realistic and threatening. But they created something flexible and meaningful enough that it could support all these different interpretations and transformations. The cursed SpongeBob phenomenon, for all its deliberate, unsettling qualities, actually demonstrates the show's enduring power to inspire creativity and emotional engagement. When people care enough about fictional characters to spend time making them disturbing or surreal, they're still engaging with those characters in a meaningful way. They're still finding new possibilities within familiar frameworks, still discovering aspects of the SpongeBob universe that resonate with their own experiences and artistic visions. Even the banned episodes and controversial content we discussed reveal something fundamentally positive about the show's cultural impact. The fact that midlife crustacean was considered acceptable for 15 years before being pulled suggests that SpongeBob exists in a cultural space where standards can evolve and improve over time. The show has been around long enough to adapt to changing social awareness, which is actually a sign of its cultural significance and staying power rather than a failure or weakness. It's also worth remembering that many of the scary SpongeBob episodes we've discussed are still fundamentally entertaining and well-crafted. Graveyard Shift is a brilliant parody of horror movies that manages to be both genuinely creepy and genuinely funny. Rock Bottom captures real anxiety about being lost and confused, but it does so through classic SpongeBob physical comedy and absurd situations. Even Face Freeze, for all its disturbing imagery, is built around a timeless moral lesson about not making weird faces. The show's ability to balance humor with more complex emotions is actually one of its greatest strengths. SpongeBob has never talked down to its audience or assumed that children can't handle anything more sophisticated than pure silliness. By occasionally venturing into weirder or more challenging territory, the show has created a richer emotional landscape that works for viewers of all ages and continues to reward engagement as people grow and change. Looking at SpongeBob's cultural impact over more than 2 decades, it's clear that the show's willingness to occasionally be strange or unsettling has been part of what's kept it relevant and influential. In an entertainment landscape full of safe, carefully managed content designed to offend nobody and challenge nothing, SpongeBob has maintained an element of unpredictability and creative risk-taking that keeps viewers engaged and creators inspired. The fact that we can spend 2 hours discussing the dark side of SpongeBob while still loving and appreciating the show demonstrates something important about good children's media and lasting cultural impact. The best kids shows don't just entertain children in the moment. They create rich enough worlds and characters that they can support multiple interpretations, inspire creative responses, and continue to reveal new layers of meaning as viewers mature and develop different perspectives. SpongeBob's scary moments, cursed memes, and psychological complexity don't detract from its essential sweetness and optimism, they enhance it. They prove that the show is substantial enough to contain multitudes, weird enough to inspire endless creativity, and meaningful enough to support serious analysis alongside silly enjoyment. So yes, SpongeBob can be genuinely creepy sometimes. Yes, it has produced some of the most disturbing children's television content ever created, from grotesque close-ups to existential horror sequences that feel more appropriate for graduate philosophy seminars than Saturday morning cartoons. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.